gather around you fucking animals. Coleman ordered as he yanked a large duffel bag and a strange metal object off the back of his GMB. After he got everything he needed, the team leader then threw the camouflage netting back over the vehicle, ensuring it blended seamlessly into the tree line they were hiding in. All 12 members of the Special Forces ODA team quickly congregated around their team leader with expressions of a mix of curiosity and anticipation while Coleman began rifling through the duffel bag. After a while, one by one, he started dropping an assortment of goodies onto the ground: canned soups, Chef Boyardee ravioli, various flavors of cup noodles from different brands, and other non-perishable comfort foods that brought a taste of home to this alien world. Murmurs of cheers went through the men as their eyes lit up at the sight of their captain's stash while Coleman focused on setting up the strange metal object. It was a compact, modern military burner designed for small teams operating covertly. With the thing finally set up, the team leader couldn't help but crack a smile. "Alright, boys, this is in celebration of us being the first Earthlings to invade another damn planet," he announced, his voice tinged with both pride and a touch of irony. "So let's enjoy some good old Earth cuisine while we plan our next move. Have you guys considered that maybe we're the horrible alien menace that invades other planets and shit like in all those movies?" Bennett suddenly yammered out as he squatted over to pick up a cup of spicy Korean ramen. The team members began grabbing their preferred meal. They all looked at Bennett for a moment before chuckling. The statement had been truly absurd, but they couldn't find any fault in the engineer's reasoning. They had truly come to push a group of sword-swinging aliens shit in. Just then, Elijah's voice cut through the chatter from the other side of their encampment. "Blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne," he proclaimed with a voice full of mock ferocity, raising his fists into the air in a dramatic gesture. He was decked out in his full kit while peering around at his comrades, highlighted by his night optical devices. Nods. "What? What do you mean by blood god?" Yana suddenly emerged from one of his pockets with her hands on her hips. "I'm your goddess. You're only allowed to worship me." Elijah was momentarily taken aback by Yana's sudden appearance and turned his head to stare at her blankly, but the incredulous look was lost under the equipment strapped snugly to his eyes. However, the medic quickly adapted his theatrics to accommodate the small goddess. With his arm still raised, he turned to look at his team and, without missing a beat, exclaimed, "Crack for the crack fairy." This, however, did not amuse Yana. With power belying her tiny size, she smacked him on the top of his head, her tiny fist making a surprisingly solid contact against his helmet. "Rude," she yelled out, her voice carrying a mix of indignation and authority. "Gah." Elijah's head recoiled from the blow as he stumbled slightly, glaring at the little fairy who now stood with her arms crossed. While the goddess' face was etched with an annoyed expression, Elijah's teammates couldn't help but erupt into laughter at the sight, their chuckles filling the forest hideout. Even Coleman was laughing. However, the man quickly regained his composure and held up his hand to quiet the team. All right, keep it down," he said through his own stifled chuckles. "Remember, we're still in the field and in a hide, so let's not forget operational security." His reminder was met with several nods and murmurs of agreement as the team members chuckled and went back to what they were doing. They knew all too well the importance of maintaining a low profile, especially when they're out in the middle of bumfuck nowhere behind enemy lines. Coleman was still maintaining his authoritative stance when he then turned his attention to the more practical aspects of their situation. "All right, let's figure out the watch rotation," he said after finally getting the stove to work and standing up. "We need eyes on all sides at all times so we don't get any nasty surprises sneaking up on us. Elijah, Bennett, you guys are up first for patrol to screen us." "Keep it tight, keep it quiet," Coleman directed, pointing to the two. "Lister, Schwartz, Silva, you're all on watch. Make sure nothing sneaks up on us." The individuals that were named acknowledged their assignments with a nod. Elijah and Bennett immediately started checking their gear, ensuring their weapons and equipment were ready for the patrol. Silva, the team's newly acquired communications specialist along with Lister and Schwartz, all took up positions that allowed them optimal coverage of the surrounding area while still being within earshot of each other. "We need to conserve what batteries we have for as long as possible, so everyone else, get as much shut-eye as you can," Coleman continued, glancing at his watch and then at the sky. "Plus, we need to be fresh and ready for whatever insanity is going to be thrown at us in a few hours." With his preparation done, Elijah turned towards Yana and noticed that she was still glaring at him with her arms crossed. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps an apology or an explanation, but before he could get a word out, Yana cut him off with a dismissive, "Humph. If you're going to talk about this stupid blood god, then I'm going to sleep somewhere else," she declared with a venomous tone. And without waiting for a response, the little goddess prompt spun around and floated away towards one of the GMVs, leaving a somewhat bewildered Elijah behind. Elijah and Bennett exchanged confused glances, each trying to make sense of what had just transpired. "What in the fuck just happened?" Elijah asked, still trying to process Yana's abrupt departure. Bennett, with a mix of amusement and confusion, shrugged. "Dude, I have no idea. This feels like some kind terrible couple segment in some shitty sitcom from the 80s, he replied, shaking his head. "Right?" Elijah said as he started walking deeper into the small forest they were hiding in. "Next thing you know she'll be serving me divorce papers and asking for alimony or some shit." The engineer chuckled at Elijah's remark. "Man, except in this world, instead of paying alimony in money, you'd probably be paying with fragments of your soul or something equally insane," he joked, following Elijah deeper into the forest. The laughter faded as the gravity of Bennett's joke hit Elijah. The medic shuddered at the thought as the dark humor reflected the bizarre reality they found themselves in. "Yeah, well, I'm never agreeing to a goddamn thing with anyone from this shithole of a world if that's how things work around here," he responded with a serious look on his face. "For all you know, actual marriage involves ripping your heart out and presenting it to your partner or something." The two men continued their patrol, scanning the area with their thermal-enhanced night vision. Despite the jokes and lighthearted banter, they were fully aware of just how dangerous the forest could be. The world around them was filled with magic, mythical creatures, and now, soul transactions. It wouldn't be far-fetched if they ran into a bloodthirsty vampire or some kind of horrible cryptid you'd find on some demented forum. Anything and everything was on the table at this point. As they moved through the shadowy forest, a sudden unease started to grip the two men. They weren't even 50 meters from their camp when they noticed that the forest around them had a strange and tense atmosphere to it. Now the two weren't native to this world, but they had ventured to the other side every now and then. There was usually a chorus of nocturnal insects and small animals in the background, but this time there were faint, but ravenous tearing noises coming from the clearing just in front of him. The two men raised their weapons into a ready position and slowly moved forward with the precision of seasoned operators. As they approached the clearing, their senses were tuned to every detail of the environment around them. Their latest generation and most advanced night vision enabled them to detect even the most subtle disturbances in the natural setting. The clues were there, plain as day under the white phosphorus and thermal glow. Snapped twigs and branches littered the ground, boot prints imprinted in the moist soil, and foliage that had been disturbed, bent, or broken. Each sign told a story, a narrative of a pair of individuals moving this way. One sloppy, the other adept and stealthy. As Elijah and Bennett neared the clearing, their night vision revealed a chilling scene. Dozens of heat signatures popped up in their vision, indicating the presence of multiple bodies. With every cautious step, the grim reality of what lay ahead was brought more into focus until they were finally greeted with a grotesque tableau of death and destruction. Blood soaked the ground, while twisted corpses and dismembered body parts were scattered in a macabre display. The lifeless forms were those of what they assumed were people told a tale of a brutal and merciless slaughter. But it wasn't just the dead that populated the area. Scavengers, drawn by the scent of death, were busy at work. These strange and giant bat-like creatures, highlighted in an orange glow of the soldiers' night vision, were ripping apart the remains, feasting on the flesh of the fallen. "Jesus Christ," Bennett whispered under his breath as he remained hidden in the shadows. "Looks like a damn feeding frenzy." Elijah barely acknowledged the engineer as his eyes scanned the area for any signs of survivors or threats. "Think it was one of those bare things," he murmured as his hand slid to the chopped down and holstered grenade launcher he kept at his side. "Fucker shouldn't be too far, corpses don't look that old." Bennett's gaze lingered on the clearing for a few moments as his mind weighed the possibilities. "Could be," he replied, his voice low and thoughtful. "But we can't rule out anything else in this godforsaken place. Could be some other monster we haven't seen yet." Spinning around to scan his surroundings, Elijah narrowed his eyes before grunting in affirmation. "Yeah, let's not stick around to find out," he suggested, a note of urgency in his voice. The brutal scene before them was a stark reminder of the dangers lurking in this alien world. As Elijah stood up, he motioned for Bennett to follow. There was no point in lingering and risking an encounter with whatever creature was responsible for the massacre. But as he glanced over his shoulder, something else caught his attention. Against the backdrop of the bright moon of this world, the faint trace of a smokestack rose into the night sky, followed by more of those giant bats flying in circles around it. "Hold up," Elijah murmured, gesturing towards the distant smoke. "You see that?" His tone was curious yet cautious. "Yeah, I see it. Looks like smoke, could be a campfire or something," Bennett replied, peering in the direction Elijah was pointing. Elijah thought for a moment as he considered the risks while observing the smokestack. "We could get a drone on it, but it's pretty dark, and those vulture bat things might snatch it. Not worth losing a drone." Bennett nodded in agreement. "Yeah, and going in ourselves is too risky. We don't know what we're walking into. Let's get the fuck out of here." On that note, the two soldiers took one last look at the smokestack before disappearing into the darkness. With sirens blaring and lights flashing, two Pittsburgh police cruisers sped down the suburban streets, racing towards the reported scene at Heidelberg Park just outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Inside one of the cruisers, Officer Derek Hawkins focused intently on the road, navigating the cruiser at breakneck speeds. His partner, Officer Jenna Larson, was next to him, coordinating closely with dispatch. "All units, please be advised," the dispatcher's urgent voice crackled over the radio. "Initial reports of a wild animal attack at Heidelberg Park have escalated. We now have confirmed reports of shots fired and multiple fatalities, including children. Proceed with extreme caution." Derek tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he briefly looked at his partner in confusion. "Wait, what?" "Dispatch, Unit 52 acknowledging. We are en route, ETA 3 minutes, Jenna responded hesitantly as she scanned her laptop for additional information. "Dispatch, do we have any description of the suspect or animal?" "Negative, Unit 52, the dispatcher replied. Witnesses are in a state of panic. We're attempting to gather more details. Be aware, the situation is highly volatile." The two partners looked at each other one more time as the cruisers continued their high-speed approach. As they turned sharply on a main road, their vision was full of more cruisers, all racing towards the same location. But as they neared the scene, the crackle of gunfire pierced through the night, its rapid staccato echoing in the distance, followed by frantic calls on the radio. "Shots fired! Shots fired! Officer down," Jenna cursed under her breath. When they finally entered the proximity of Heidelberg Park, all they could see were plumes of smoke with fire lashing up in the sky and a mass of freshly arrived cruisers with police officers climbing out of them. Jenna was working on unlocking the AR-15s from the gun rack and started quickly prepping the weapons when they came to a hard stop. The terrifying barks of gunfire resounded as Jenna handed Derek his rifle, before too swiftly exiting their vehicle. At this point, their meticulously instilled training kicked in as they moved swiftly, pointing their weapons in the direction others officers were while scanning for any visible threats. However, their gaze was greeted with nothing but horror as their eyes snapped to the victims of the brutal attack. Multiple adults and children lay motionless on the ground with a morbid and dizzying array of wounds. "Dispatch. We're on scene," Jenna reported as she sprinted towards an officer with multiple shards of metal or what looked like stone lodged in his leg and vest. "We have multiple casualties, including civilians," she said as she helped a responding police officer to drag the injured man away. Everywhere they looked was a scene of chaos and devastation. Two police cruisers, mere meters away from where Derek and Jenna had parked, looked like they had been torn apart by some immense force, with the mangled metal and shattered glass lay scattered across the street. Wounded civilians, some clutching at what looked like burn wounds and laceration injuries, huddled behind the relative safety of sheriff and police cruisers with faces etched with pain and terror. To make matters worse, a couple of houses near the park had caught fire. The flames, initially small and manageable, had quickly turned into a raging inferno, casting an ominous glow over the scene. The heat from the fires was intense, and the thick smoke billowed into the sky, further adding to the chaos. Positioning himself behind the engine block, Derek threw his rifle over the hood and took aim towards the park. His heart raced as he scanned the area for any sign of the assailant or assailants responsible for this massacre. The cries of the injured and the shouts of officers trying to coordinate a response filled the air, creating a cacophony of despair and urgency. He turned towards Jenna and saw the first aid kit that was hastily strewn about the ground as the woman rushed to tighten a tourniquet around a young woman's leg with panicked hands. But as Derek turned his vision back to the playground, movement caught his eye. Emerging from the tree-line of the playground were several small, horrific-looking creatures. They stood about 4 feet tall, with sinewy, muscular bodies that seemed to be a grotesque caricature of a rabid possum with a frontal pouch like some kind of mutated kangaroo. Their fur was matted and bristly, and their faces were twisted into snarling, feral grimaces, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Derek's blood ran cold as he recognized these creatures from the news coverage of the Ohio incident and remembered the name given to them after the dust had settled, scroungers. These nightmarish beings were now darting towards the center of the playground, where injured adults and children laid crying. Before anyone could react, one of the scroungers grabbed a young girl and began dragging it away, its sharp claws digging into the young victim's flesh as the child screamed in terror. "Dispatch, the goddamn monsters from Ohio are here!" An officer screamed into his radio. Without even a second thought, Derek began firing his weapon, causing the horrible beast to screech and release its grip on the girl as it fell to the ground and scrambled away. Other officers also started to open fire, but something they never had dreamed of happened. Strange blue hexagonal barriers appeared out of thin air, deflecting the bullets with an eerie, shimmering glow. The officers, taken aback by this unforeseen defense, hesitated momentarily, their training ill-equipped for such a supernatural phenomenon. A slew of curses left Derek's mouth as he saw the round after round simply bounce off the erected barriers. But seeing as he saw more of those horrible things run out to grab more victims, he knew what he had to do. Breaking his cover, Derek half-sprinted, half-jogged towards the playground, firing his weapon repeatedly in an attempt to keep them suppressed as he closed the distance. His mind raced, calculating the odds as he approached the shimmering barriers. But surprisingly, as he neared one, he found himself passing through it effortlessly. It was as if the barriers were selectively permeable, stopping bullets, but allowing physical passage. Taking advantage of the situation, Derek lunged at the nearest scrounger that was manipulating the barrier. His tackle hit the creature with full force, knocking it to the ground. The scrounger hissed and snarled, revealing its sharp teeth as it clawed and bit the officer. Derek, however, continued to grapple with the creature in an effort to subdue it and ignored its vicious attacks. The breakthrough with the barrier gave the other officers the opening they needed. They began firing their weapons at the now vulnerable targets, mowing down the ones that weren't dragging away a victim. More officers joined in, tackling and subduing the scroungers who were dragging children away. One officer, caught in a fierce struggle with a scrounger, used his rifle like a club. With a powerful swing, he brought the butt of his rifle down onto the creature's head. There was a sickening snap as the stock broke upon impact, and the scrounger collapsed to the ground, motionless. The park had turned into a complete melee, with officers and scroungers engaged in close-quarters combat. The officers, though initially caught off guard by the bizarre and otherworldly nature of their foes, found that even though their claws and crude weapons were intimidating, they weren't all that strong and were easily overpowered. As Derek continued to roll and wrestle with the scrounger, it ended on top of him and snapped at his face with his twisted snout, but another crack resounded as Jenna slammed the butt of her rifle into the creature's head. Jenna's timely intervention was a godsend for Derek. With a series of brutal strikes, the woman screamed as she relentlessly beat the scrounger off her partner. Each impact of her rifle's butt against the creature's head was accompanied by a "fuck you" and a sickening crunch as the force of her blows began to break parts of the stock off and splattering foul-smelling blood in every direction. "Piece of fucking shit," she screamed, basically stabbing the now exposed buffer tube of her AR-15 into the thing's face. "Fuck you." After several more vicious strikes, the scrounger finally lay still, its body twitching in the final throes of death. Jenna, panting heavily from the exertion, dropped the broken remnants of her rifle and looked around to see the bodies of scroungers lay scattered about. In the chaos, some of the creatures had managed to escape, scrambling into the tree-line and disappearing into the thick underbrush, but the officers had managed to save who they could and beat the vermin back. The air, once filled with the sounds of battle, was now pierced by the incessant wail of arriving sirens as more emergency responders converged on the chaotic scene, while the officers, battered but unbowed, rose to tend to the wounded. As the last echoes of the savage struggle faded, the park was in turn filled with the continuous wail of approaching sirens, as more first responders rushed to the nightmarish scene. Weary and shaken, the officers turned their attention to the wounded, mustering their remaining strength and moved to render aid to the victims of this terror. With the morning sun peeking over the horizon, casting a soft golden hue through the dense forest. The ODA team, consisting of 6 members, moved with the precision and silence characteristic of elite special forces. They maintained proper dispersion, each member spaced evenly apart yet within visual range of each other, a silent formation moving as one through the underbrush. As they ventured deeper into the woods, their steps were cautious and calculated, barely making a sound. Each team member was keenly aware of their surroundings, eyes scanning for any sign of danger or irregularity in the dense foliage. Above them, a drone hummed quietly, almost imperceptibly high and flying against the morning sun to cover its approach and serve as an eye in the sky, guiding the team toward their destination. The small drone's optics zoomed in on a small break in the forest canopy, revealing the source of the smokestack that Elijah and Bennett had spotted the night before. Baron 1, this is Baron 2. Be advised, we have a singular individual moving about near the source of the fire. Over, came the static-filled voice from the radio, relaying information from the drone operator to the ground team. Coleman looked up at one of those wing horrors that looked like a deranged amalgamation of a bat and a lemur in a tree he was under and watched as it hissed at him before flying off. Baron 2, this is Baron 1, acknowledged. Maintain overwatch. We're moving in to investigate, over. As the team continued their cautious advance, they finally came across the clearing Elijah and Bennett had described the night prior. All 6 of the team were greeted with the sight of bloodied bones and viscera, picked nearly clean and scattered across the ground. Fuck me. Silva, the team's communications specialist, cringed as they all squatted behind some bushes. The atmosphere grew more intense as the ODA adjusted their positions while they maneuvered into better vantage points. Once they got into position, they looked into the clearing itself and observed 2 lone scavengers while they tore at the remnants of viscera, trying to get any amount of meat from the already cleanly picked bones. Coleman crouched low, his eyes scanning the clearing and the surrounding forest. Okay, so. How do you guys want to approach this? He whispered, turning to his men. Bennett watched through his optic as the beast grabbed a blood skull and snapped it open before munching away at its contents. We could try moving through the clearing. It's more direct, and we only have to deal with only 2 of those things. Elijah, positioned slightly behind Bennett, frowned. But that also puts us out in the open. If there's anyone else around, it won't exactly end well. But there's tons of those things in the trees. I mean, we already startled a few, so if we go around there's a good chance we wake up the entire flock if they're in there. Schwartz added his thoughts as he adjusted his rifle. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Nodding thoughtfully, Coleman weighed the options presented by his team. They were put in quite the dilemma. On one hand, traversing the clearing offered a direct approach but with the risk of exposure. On the other hand, circumnavigating through the dense forest provided concealment but carried the potential danger of disturbing a larger number of those scavengers or encountering something else altogether. After a moment of contemplation, Coleman made his decision. We'll go through the clearing, he said decisively. The risk of waking up a whole host of those things in the trees is too high. At best, we cause a mass exodus, alerting someone to our presence. At worst, we get overwhelmed and join the bones in that clearing. He glanced at his team members, each of whom nodded in understanding. We'll go through the clearing. Lister, Schwartz, Silva, you're to hold position here and cover us as we make the approach. If shit goes sideways, you're gonna pull our asses out of the fire. The 3 men nodded before stealthily standing up and moving to take up positions that provided a clear line of sight to the clearing. Turning to Elijah and Bennett, Coleman detailed the next part of their plan. Eli, you got the rattler, so you're up front. Smoke them quickly and quietly. Once they're down, we're breaking to the other side of the clearing. Bennett, you're with me, Coleman continued. We're going to be hugging Eli's ass. He said, racking his charging handle back on his suppressed assault rifle to make sure there was a round in it. We gotta make it quick and quiet. Coleman's voice was calm yet authoritative as he finished outlining the plan. Remember, speed and aggression. We hit those scavengers fast, then move quickly and stay low. We're not here to be decisively engaged. We get in, bag whoever is making that smoke, and see if they got any intel for us. The moment Coleman finished his instructions, the team switched gears as they all quietly and quickly moved around. It was time to work. Without a word, Elijah set up behind a tree with his specialized short-barrel rifle equipped with a large suppressor and took aim. Meanwhile, Coleman and Bennett, in perfect sync with their point man, stacked up behind Elijah. The team leader placed his palm gently on Elijah's shoulder, a silent signal that they were in position and ready. A second later, Coleman's grip on Elijah's shoulder tightened sharply, a clear indication to engage. The quiet of the early morning was punctured by the faint snaps of subsonic rounds, causing the first scavenger to drop instantly as it took a precise shot to the skull. The second creature let out a startled squawk, thrashing in surprise, but it too was quickly silenced as more rounds hissed through the air, ending its life with deadly efficiency. With the scavengers neutralized, Elijah, Coleman, and Bennett immediately broke cover, swiftly moving across the clearing. Each man had his weapon raised, covering different sectors to ensure nothing could fully sneak up on them without catching some lead as they advanced. But once Elijah broke into thicket of the opposing tree line, several more snaps of his weapon firing as he targeted 4 more scavengers that were perched unsuspectingly in a nearby tree. The creatures, caught completely off guard, fell limply to the ground while the remaining scavengers, taken aback by the sudden demise of their kin, hissed and snapped their beaks in agitation. However, recognizing the lethal threat posed by the intruders, they chose to flee to other trees rather than confront something that could kill 4 of their own in just as many seconds. But let's make sure they understand who's in charge here, Coleman said as they moved forward, opting for intimidation. Every so often, Elijah's weapon would hiss out of hatred, ending any beast that lingered too long or showed any sign of aggression. It didn't take long for the flock to get with the program after watching the folly of any of their more braver kin. With each body, the massive monsters gave another meter of distance as clear acknowledgement of the trio's dominance. Despite their initial success, the small team soon realized that they had potentially ventured too deep into hostile territory. But there was no turning back now. Momentum was already in their favor, and they couldn't afford anything other than full commitment to their current course. As the 3 continued to move through the forest, they found that they had pushed completely through the horde of giant bat-like scavengers. The creatures themselves scrambled away as they recognized the threat these strange humans posed. After the last brave monster crumbled to the ground, the rest either flew off or scrambled back into their trees, leaving the path ahead unobstructed. Looking around with a furrowed brow, Bennett's eye flashed towards Coleman when he noticed they were in the clear. "Okay, so," he murmured, keeping his weapon pointed to where the monsters huddled in the tree. "What the fuck do we do now?" Coleman scowled as he scanned his surroundings. A small curse left his lips as he grabbed his push to talk and growled, "All Baron elements, this is Baron 1, Coleman's voice transmitted clearly over the radio. "Be advised, we have successfully navigated through the flock. Encountered and neutralized multiple hostiles, with no casualties on our side. We are now proceeding towards the objective. Over." While Coleman updated the rest of the team, Elijah quietly reloaded a fresh magazine before slowly creeping towards through the brush. Through the brush, he saw what looked like the faint flickering light of a dying flame. Meanwhile, both Bennett and Coleman gave the medic the side eye as the man stalked forward, but they quickly moved to follow while Coleman still quietly relayed information and instructions to the rest of the team. However, it didn't take long for them to also spot the glow dancing in the surroundings of the surrounding trees and shrubbery. As they closed in, the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds were the faint crackling of the distant fire and the soft rustle of the wind, rustling the foliage as they silently maneuvered into position. Suddenly, a feminine voice pierced the stillness and echoed through the trees. The words were indistinct, muffled by distance and the dense forest, but the tone was unmistakable and was laced with a mixture of distress or anger. There, they saw a figure hobbling around, swinging what looked like a branch in a wild manner as if trying to ward something off. And when they neared, the intelligible yelling started to slowly make sense as their intense language training over the past half-year started to pay off. It was rough, but they could understand the desperate cries of the injured woman while she yelled for someone, or something, to get away from her. "Disgusting fucking vermin." The voice screeched out after swinging whatever was in her hand once more. Coleman, Elijah, and Bennett were crouched on one knee each, blending into the underbrush when a loud smack rang out. Their eyes narrowed as another monstrous figure screeched and flailed around before the woman raised what she had in her hand in the air and brought it down on top of whatever she had initially hit. "You want some too? I'll kill all you fucks." The vicious battle cry made Coleman shift his weapon slightly in his hands. There was something about the yell that felt odd and pressured him to seek out the familiar weight and balance of his rifle as he remained focused on the woman's figure through the trees. His gaze then shifted to Elijah and Bennett. "What do you all think we should do?" he whispered, before looking back at the woman swinging her branch. Bennett remained silent as his mind undoubtedly raced through their options, but Elijah let out a deep and measured sigh. His eyes intently observed the woman's desperate defense against what he assumed were more of those lemur bat scavenger things. "Fuck it, we should make contact," he finally said, breaking the silence. "Whoever she is, she's injured, and fighting off those things alone. Maybe we can work something out for some information." Silence reigned for a few moments as Coleman and Bennett exchanged an uncertain look. They knew there were a multitude of unknowns that could quickly turn volatile if they engaged with whoever was in the thicket, especially in this godforsaken world. Yet, a better option wasn't exactly forthcoming, and the confidence in Elijah's voice swayed them. "All right," Coleman said uneasily. "We'll make contact, but keep on your toes." He stood up and sucked in a deep breath to prepare himself for what was to come. "Eli, you lead. You've got the best handle on the language. We keep it tight and controlled. I'll be on overwatch and watch our six. Bennett, you're with Eli, keep it non-threatening, but don't let him get wasted. Weapons low, but be ready for anything. We don't know if she's a wizard or some shit or even if she's even alone." With their roles clearly defined, the three men carefully made their way forward. Their rifles were angled towards the ground in a less threatening, but ready posture as they began to edge towards the woman. Coleman trailed behind his men and kept a watchful eye on their surroundings, scanning for any potential threats that might pop out while Bennett stayed close to Elijah. As they moved closer, the sounds of the woman's struggle grew louder, and the occasional thud of her makeshift weapon echoed through the trees. She swung the admittedly thick branch one more time and caused one of those scavengers to tumble across the ground and go limp. Growls and hisses resounded as the remaining creatures scampered away and took to the air or retreated into the underbrush. As the thicket settled into a tense silence, the woman groaned in pain as she stumbled to the ground while a slew of curses left her mouth. But as she started to get settled, the woman's face snapped up as two figures pierced through the foliage. "No," she yelled with her orange eyes went wide with shock. "Stay away." Fear gripped her entire being and her breaths became ragged as she started to desperately crawl away. Elijah furrowed his brow as he looked her up and down. She was almost a carbon copy of some Nordic woman from Sweden or Norway, except with pointy ears. And just like that the other elves Yana had harassed on the other side, this one was a beauty. Raising his hand in a clear sign of peace, Elijah continued forward slowly and cautiously, closing the gap with the woman. However, as a precaution, his other hand remained on his rifle while Bennett took up a position behind a tree and kept his weapon ready in order to react to any sudden movement. "We're not here to harm you," Elijah tried to sound as non-threatening as he could as he crept forward. "We just want to dash." The words were caught in Elijah's mouth when he saw the woman's hand abruptly shot out, grabbing a sizable stone. With a grunt that was more of a battle cry, she channeled what seemed like a burst of energy into her arm and hurled the thing straight at Elijah, causing him to instinctively flinch away. "If you're not here to hurt me, then go away," she snapped as the stone whizzed past the intruder and slammed into the tree next to him. A fraction of a second later, Bennett's rifle snapped up and pointed at the woman to end the threat, but Elijah quickly interjected, Wait. Don't fucking shoot her." He yelled, putting himself between the two to prevent any further escalation. "Eli, what the fuck are you doing?" Bennett yelled back, slightly lowering his weapon so it wasn't pointed at his teammate. "She just tried to fucking brain you with a goddamn rock." Ignoring Bennett's outburst, Elijah let go of his rifle completely and allowed it to dangle freely from its sling. He raised both hands in a more pronounced gesture of peace while urging Bennett to calm down. "Bro, chill, I got this," he calmly replied, trying to diffuse both the tension. "You're fucking insane." Bennett hissed back in a quiet, intense yell, his eyes darting between Elijah and the woman. "She took out a chunk of a tree with a goddamn rock, and you want to play footsie with this bitch." However, the warning went unheeded and Bennett murmured another curse before shifting positions to get a better shot on the woman. "I swear to God, your dick is going to get you killed." Despite her obvious pain, the injured woman was having none of it. She groaned in pain and managed to grab another sizable stone and cocked back her arm in preparation for another throw, but Elijah's hands remained raised, even as he sensed Bennett's growing frustration behind him. No. Wait." Elijah yelled out in a pleading manner, hoping to stop her. Wait. Relax. You're hurt, I can help." The woman paused, her arm still tensed and ready to launch the stone, but her eyes locked onto Elijah's. There was a moment of intense stillness, a standoff where every second seemed to stretch on infinitely as the in her arm eased. The stone still gripped firmly in her hand was ready to accelerate at a moment's notice, but it was clear she was entertaining this moment of parley. Elijah noticed her breathing was ragged as a mix of pain and exertion was displayed in her posture. Her eyes, still filled with wariness, flickered over the medic's face, searching for any sign of deceit or aggression. "Look, we don't want to fight," Elijah continued, carefully choosing his words. "We have a..." His fingers made a beckoning motion while his eyes moved to the side as he tried to remember the words. "Healing things. We can treat your wounds. Just let us help you," he explained in a soothing voice. "Stay where you are," the blonde barked. Coming to a complete stop, Elijah nodded in understanding and tried to convey his sincerity through his body language as much as he could. Okay. I'll stay here," he assured her. The woman's expression remained wary and her gaze darted between Elijah and Bennett, who was in her eye was holding a strange weapon. She had heard rumors of strange humans with strange foliage-colored uniforms from some associates and in her mission planning, so she knew well enough what the man was pointing at her was dangerous. "If you have healing potions, just toss it to me," she demanded, her tone indicating that she wasn't ready to lower her guard just yet. Slightly taken aback by the request, Elijah blinked a few times before glancing back at Bennett for a brief moment. He realized that with his limited abilities in the language, explaining that his healing ability lay in trauma care rather than potions or magical bullshit, was going to be quite the challenge. "We, don't have potions," Elijah tried to explain, choosing his words with care. "I'm a healer, but not with magic. I use different things to help with injuries." He gestured to his medical kit. "But it's real. I can help you." The snarl on her face indicated to Elijah that she really didn't like that answer. "Wait. Just wait," Elijah yelled, throwing his hands forward when he saw the look on the blonde elf's face. Her grip on the stone had tightened, and her arm tensed as she cocked it back to throw it. "You think I'm just going to allow some freak to rob me?" she barked in anger. "Can't you losers wait until I at least die?" What? "We're not here to rob you," Elijah said, slowly detaching the more portable aid pack that was attached to his waist. "You're hurt, and I have the skills to provide, care. It's not magic, but it will work." The woman hesitated, her arm still raised, but the intensity of her posture lessening slightly. Torn between her instinct to defend herself and the intense pain that coursed through her body, her gaze darted between the strange man's medical kit and his earnest face. In an attempt to assess and weigh her options, the injured elf studied the contents of Elijah's satchel. Everything in it resembled what she might expect from a rudimentary healer in some town, yet far more sophisticated. There were neatly organized bandages, antiseptics, and various medical tools that she had never seen before. It was clear that this man was not lying when he said he was a healer. Albeit a mundane healer, but was she really in a position to be picky? With the pain gnawing at her and weakening her resolve, she finally relented. Her hand, trembling slightly from the strain, slowly lowered the stone to the ground. She made a decision to gamble on the trustworthiness of the man in front of her. "Fine," she said in a pained and reluctant tone, wincing as she adjusted her position to grant better access to her injuries. "But if this is a trick, you can bash my head in with a rock," Elijah replied, walking forward before taking a knee right next to her. He then pointed to himself and said, "Elijah." Then he pointed towards the man who still had a strange weapon trained on her. "Bennett." A look of wariness colored the woman's face as the strange healer introduced himself and his companion. Her gaze flickered to the one called Bennett who was still training his odd weapon on her, and then back to Elijah. Despite the pain and her initial reluctance, there was a sense of curiosity in her expression. After a brief pause, she seemed to relent with an exhausted sigh, and she reciprocated the introduction. "Azaleen," she said, pointing at herself. Elijah began to nod, surprised things were going as well as they were. "See? This isn't so bad," he said, glancing back at Bennett. "Right, Ben?" "Fuck you," the engineer barked back angrily. "You're a goddamn lunatic," he added, reluctantly lowering his weapon. "All this cosmic bullshit has scrambled your brains." Elijah chuckled derisively, unable to refute the accusation. Maybe, but it's working, isn't it? We're making progress here. Azaleen watched their interaction with a mixture of confusion and interest. She couldn't understand a word they were saying, but the familiar dynamics between the two men were similar to that of freelancers. But she wasn't going to let that distract her from her vigilance. Azaleen still needed to stay alert and gauge whether their intentions were as genuine as they claimed. As Elijah began to assess Azaleen's injuries, his brow started to furrow at the extent of her injuries. He knew his basic trauma kit and lack of resources would allow him to provide very limited care, but he had to make the best of whatever he had. Pulling out his shears, he slowly cut away at the fabric around Azaleen's wounds to get a better look. Jesus Christ! How haven't you bled out already? He mumbled as he pulled out his antiseptic wipes and started cleaning the stab wound. He knew he couldn't do much about the internal damage at the current moment, so now his only concern was infections and preventing any further blood loss. While Elijah worked on his new patient, Coleman emerged from the shadow and walked up right next to Bennett. He observed Elijah's work for a moment before turning to Bennett. "You think she knows anything?" Coleman asked, his voice low and contemplative. Bennett turned around and eyed the surroundings, before offering a simple shrug. "I'm more concerned about how in the hell we're supposed to get her out of here with those demon bats lurking about," he responded with a slightly frustrated tone. It was clear that the presence of the menacing creatures in the area was weighing heavily on his mind. Coleman let out a sigh. The presence of the menacing creatures in the area also weighed heavily on his mind. The extraction of this woman for interrogation and further treatment made things a lot more complicated. Pressing down on his push-to-talk, Coleman spoke into the headset. "Baron 2, this is Baron 1. We've made contact with a local that needs to be extracted for further treatment. Stand by for next, over." He relayed the situation, his voice firm yet tinged with the strain of their predicament. As the acknowledgement came over the radio, Coleman turned to Elijah and spoke up, "Hey, can we move her?" Elijah continued to work on Azaleen's injuries as he replied to Coleman without looking away. "We can move her, but it's going to be tricky," he said, his hands skillfully applying a final bandage to the stab wound. "She's got a fractured hip and a broken arm, which complicates things. The stab wound is stable for now, but I'm going to need my full kit real fucking fast." The medic then moved to assess her hip. With the resources at hand, he couldn't do much more than ensure she was as comfortable as possible. "We'll need to be gentle with her, especially with that hip. Any jostling around could make it worse," Elijah explained. He then moved to get her into a sling for her broken arm. Finishing up, Elijah stood and faced Coleman. "We should try to keep her movements to a minimum, but I don't got a stretcher on me," he said, pulling off his latex gloves. "So that means one of us is gonna have to carry her through the forest." A difficult look spread across Coleman's face as he started to think. "Can you sedate her?" he asked, looking behind him at the path they took to get here. Elijah hesitated for a moment before answering. Yes. But I'm not particularly familiar with elf physiology. We're limited on supplies, and while reports show that they're compatible, I still can't predict how she'll react to our shit," he cautioned with a look of uncertainty on his face. Coleman furrowed his brows as he processed this information. After weighing his options for a moment, he came to a quick decision. "Sedate her. I'm not going to be the one responsible for her screaming in agony all day," he stated firmly, unwilling to let something like that weigh on his conscience. "She'll either die of shock or die high as fuck, but without pain. And if I had to choose, it would be the latter." The ODA team leader then turned his attention back to the radio and pressed down on his push-to-talk button. "Baron 2, this is Baron 1. Prep the vehicles for exfil. When we get there, we're hauling ass out. Expect an injured +1. Over," he instructed clearly and concisely, following proper radio protocol. After receiving the confirmation from Baron 2, Coleman switched channels to contact another team member. "Baron 3, this is Baron 1. Prep 9 bangs and start dispersing them in the forest. Create a diversion and cover our exfil. Sync for 10 minutes. Acknowledge, over." Lister's voice crackled through the radio. "Baron 1, this is Baron 3. Copy that. Prepping 9 bangs for diversion. Timing set for 10 minutes. Out." A few beeps resounded as Coleman started the timer on his watch. He then turned back to Bennett and Elijah. "We got 10 minutes, drug her up and prep her to move." His gaze lingered on Azaleen, who was staring at him with a confused look on her face. Azaleen, watching the interaction with growing apprehension, finally spoke up. "What are you talking about?" she asked Elijah with a voice full of apprehension while her eyes flicked between the men. Elijah, who had been preparing the sedative, paused and looked at Azaleen. His grasp of her language wasn't exactly ideal, but it was still enough to hold a proper conversation even though there was still a slightly janky quality to it. "We need to move you," he explained carefully. "We don't have the proper supplies here to treat you fully, and there's a horde of those weird monster things out there. It's not safe." "The rotwings? Or do you mean the grove moss?" she asked with a look of concern on her face. Silence reigned for a moment as Elijah gave her a strange look, but after a few moments he then pointed to one of the dead scavengers nearby. "Those things." "Ah. Rotwings," Azaleen nodded. "Harmless alone and cowardly even when in groups, but if there's enough of them then it's a problem. It's rare, but if they swarm and Azaleen was suddenly cut off by a sharp sensation at her side, causing her to jolt and exclaim, "Hey! What was that for?" A thoughtful look clouded Elijah's face for a moment before he waved his hand dismissively. "Ah, don't worry about it. I'm stopping your pain," he explained. He had been careful with the dosage, seeing as her species were rather sensitive to such medications, but the effects immediately became noticeable. "What do you mean woo-wah?" Azaleen tried to reply, but suddenly became unsteady and started swinging about. Her pupils then began to dilate as she looked at Elijah with a mix of surprise and drowsiness. "I feel weird," she mumbled with slurred words. Elijah rubbed his beard for a few moments as he monitored her closely. He had tried to give her less than what was recommended to take the edge off, but it appeared much more effective than he initially thought. "Huh, would you look at that?" he muttered to himself, a hint of surprise in his voice. "I guess even a small dose is pretty potent for you. I could just water this shit down, . Suddenly thunk resounded as Azaleen fell back with her eyes staring up at the sky. "Whoa," she moaned in awe as colors and strange shapes populated her world. "Is that what purple tastes like?" Everyone looked at each other for a few moments, unsure what to make of the situation. Bennett was the first to speak up with a voice tinged with a mix of concern and practicality. We should probably move her now while she's calm and high as shit." "Yeah, that's probably a good idea," Coleman replied, pulling off a 9-bang from a pouch and giving Elijah an accusatory look. "How much of that shit did you give her?" Elijah, noticing the look, put up both his hands in a defensive gesture. "Look, I tried to give her less than what was recommended, okay," he explained, his tone a mixture of frustration and concern. "Elves clearly react differently to this stuff. I didn't expect it to hit her this hard." Coleman gave his medic an incredulous look before turning his attention back to his watch. "Look, just make sure she's stable for the transport. I don't want her freaking out in the middle of the forest," he said as Elijah grabbed Azaleen's arm and hoisted her up into a fireman's carry with a grunt. A surprised look came over Elijah's face once he got her settled on his shoulders. Despite her slender appearance, Azaleen was surprisingly heavy. "God damn, she must be all muscle or some shit," he commented, adjusting his grip to better distribute her weight before walking towards Coleman. However, Azaleen suddenly stirred in Elijah's hold and pointed to her makeshift campfire. Wait, she mumbled, still completely out of it. She weakly pointed at her satchel lying right next to where she slept. "Can you grab the thingy thing?" "I need the thingy thing," she slurred, trying to convey the importance of her belongings. "It has all my bribe money and the patrol maps and the bribe money." Everyone froze in place and turned to the woman as she hung limply on Elijah's shoulders. "Patrol routes? What do you mean by patrol routes?" Bennett questioned curiously as he and Coleman eyed the satchel intensely. Patrol routes," she said with a nod, her words slurred and her eyelids fluttering. "We got maps, lots of squiggly lines and dots, shows where the big, bad, shiny guys march and set up camp for when we smuggle stuff." She gestured vaguely in the air, as if drawing invisible lines. "And the bribe money?" Coleman chimed in, trying to piece together her disjointed information. A gasp resounded as Azaleen slapped her mouth with her hand. Oh, the money! I completely forgot about the money," she exclaimed with a sudden burst of energy, only to slump back down. "Yeah, we gave shiny coins to a shiny man. He told us secrets, lots of secrets. About the thingy-maboops, with the Imperials. Her voice trailed off as she seemed to lose track of her thoughts. Did I mention I can't leave the bribe money? I need that to get past those stupid forts they just built. Huh, ain't that some shit, Elijah muttered, as Bennett jogged over to the satchel and began rummaging through it. As the engineers pulled out and unfolded a piece of what felt like leather parchment, he let out a whistle. God damn, they even got the rift on this bitch, he said with a voice full of awe and disbelief. He held the parchment up, revealing a detailed map that included not only troop concentrations and patrol routes, but also marked areas that were deemed no-go zones. It was a little rough, but it provided a general overview of key strategic points, and it was still invaluable for its potential to offer a broader understanding of Imperial movements and fortifications if it wasn't outright garbage. However, they were still tasked to reconnoiter these areas, and if there was even an inkling of truth to the map, then their jobs would be made a lot easier. After examining the map, Bennett recognized its significance, despite its roughness. This might not be perfect for detailed planning, but it's a solid reference point, he noted. It gives us an idea of what we're dealing with. Bag everything we can use. We only got a couple minutes until we bust out of here, Coleman instructed as his eyes stayed glued to his watch. Bennett carefully pushed the parchment back into the satchel and then proceeded to wander around the makeshift camp scooping up anything and everything that looked even remotely interesting or useful. As he finished gathering whatever he could, Bennett then secured the satchel tightly before he made his way back to stand next to Coleman. Checking his rifle, the engineer made sure he was ready to go as Coleman pulled the pin on his 9-bang and started counting down over the radio. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Mark. As he shouted the last word, he threw the device deep into the forest. The 9-bang was designed as a replacement to the standard M84 stun grenade. It was made to create multiple deafening and concussive explosions to disorient the enemy, and it worked exactly as intended. Almost immediately after Coleman's throw, a series of loud blasts echoed throughout the forest at different locations. It wasn't perfectly simultaneous, but the effect was just as effective. Startled by the sudden cacophony and bright flashes, the horde of rotwings screeched in panic, and in a large, chaotic mass, they took to the sky, fleeing in disarray. The dense canopy of the forest was momentarily filled with the dark silhouettes of the creatures, creating an almost surreal spectacle as they flew off into the distance. Boom, 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 Azaleen murmured in a dazed and distant tone. Her words were almost lost under the sound of the 9-bangs and the panicking creatures. Coleman looked up through the canopy before turning back and looking at his men before giving them a nod of satisfaction. Let's move, he said, gesturing towards the path they took to get here. Taking the lead, Coleman confidently navigated through the forest, retracing the path they had previously trekked to find their new friend that rested on Elijah's shoulders. The medic himself followed closely behind Coleman while Azaleen couldn't help but murmured observations of the chaos around them continued, though she remained in a dazed state due to the sedative. Bennett pulled up the rear to maintain some semblance of security in case any of those winged horrors stuck around. But it seemed that their vigilance was wasted due to the initial effectiveness of the 9-bangs. While there wasn't a single rotwing in the trees nor on the ground, he did notice the corpses of those monsters that Elijah had killed earlier were half-eaten. These things are cannibalistic too. How endearing, he commented dryly, cringing at the sight. Elijah, trying to balance Azaleen as he stepped over a massive root. Nature's charming in its own twisted way, he responded with a grimace. With a shake of their heads, the three men continued their journey through the now seemingly empty forest. Not a single rotwing, let alone any being bothered to stay behind after their little stunt, but the silence added another layer of eeriness that put them on edge. The exodus of the monsters must have more than likely drawn a few discerning eyes, so they needed to make like a tree and leave. Their new friend slowed the trek, but the three finally linked up with the rest of their squad and made their way to the rest of the ODA. The team in question had shit-eating grins plastered all over their faces as they waited with the vehicles. Sergeant Jason Kwan, the ODA's team sergeant, watched with a raised eyebrow as Elijah approached with their new charge. Kwan, a medium-built Asian American, carried an air of authority and experience in his athletic frame that told of years of being in the field in multiple theaters of conflict. The sergeant jumped out of his GMV and moved to Elijah's vehicle to open the door for him. Of course she'd bring back a woman, the sergeant teased, with a hint of amusement in his voice and curiosity in his eyes. The slight accent in his voice hinted at his Hong Kong heritage, adding a unique aspect to his commanding presence. Is she drooling on you? A mischievous chuckle left Elijah's mouth as he bent down and placed her inside one of the GMVs. Hee, yeah, I swooned her, he explained. Quan and the team laughed as they started to climb into their vehicles. Roofies don't count, the sergeant joked as he shook his head. A snort left Coleman's mouth as he climbed into the turret of his GMV. Alright. Wrap it up, let's get the hell out of here, before someone gets wise and checks this shithole out. The team leader interjected, before spinning a single finger in the air to signal to everyone it was time to make their leave. The engines of the GMVs hummed to life, and the convoy began to make their way out of the treeline, leaving the eerie forest in their wake. Azaline's mind was a chaotic mess of vivid dreams, induced by that damned human. Even in her unconscious state, her senses were alive with intense and disturbing memories of when she was a shield maiden. In the depths of her drug-induced dreams, Azaline's mind wandered back to her early years, to a time when she was a young girl growing up in the unforgiving lands of the north. A land that was fractured and plagued by wars. Her village had been under the protection of a local lord, and unfortunately, said lord was both a traitor and a blasphemer. Thane Eirik, the low-ranking nobleman presiding over the land, had chosen to back the wrong deity during a period of heavenly upheaval known as the Divine Turbulence. This era was marked by intense infighting among the various gods, each vying for the souls and the devotion of the mortal realm. Thane Eirik's allegiance to a now-fallen goddess had dire consequences for him and the people of his lands. The once peaceful and cozy community that Azaleen had called home had been razed to the ground, while the small village burned and its men slaughtered. The survivors, including Azaleen, were turned into thralls, forced to serve the new rulers and new gods. However, amidst this darkness, there was presented with a sliver of hope, a chance at redemption. Azaleen was given the opportunity to forsake the name of the fallen goddess, forsake her family, and accept a childhood devoid of any innocence or joy. To pledge her allegiance to Jarl Hrothgar, her conqueror, and become a shield maiden. This transition for Azaleen was far from easy or dignified. The path from thrall to shield maiden under the Jarl was laden with relentless challenges and trials that spanned years. It was a journey that tested not only her physical strength, but also her mental and emotional resilience. Every day, Azaleen and the other trainees were pushed to their limit, undergoing brutal and unforgiving training. They were taught how to wield swords, axes, spears, and shields, how to fight individually and as a unit. But beyond the physical hardships, there was an emotional toll that weighed heavily on Azaleen. Being a former thrall, she was often subjected to the disdain from those who saw her as nothing more than a conquered savage, and she was only greeted with mockery and scorn from some of her peers. The emotional scars ran deep, as Azaleen was forced to navigate a world where her worth was constantly questioned and her presence often unwelcome. Whispered insults and disdainful looks were a common occurrence, especially when the trainers and her betters would occasionally subject her to abuses and humiliations that slowly chipped at her will. But for Azaleen, the price of failure was far steeper. However, the degradation and exploitation as a thrall that some of the warriors and cadre was a price Azaleen was willing to pay. Being viewed as mere property and having her betters force themselves upon her paled in comparison to the threat of failure. In the north, a failed shield maiden, especially one with the background of a thrall, could be claimed by any huskarl or drang as their property, relegated to a life of servitude and treated as breeding stock. The fear of returning to a life devoid of agency and avoiding the life of being a literal sex slave was a potent motivator for Azaleen. She was determined not to succumb to the pressure, unlike many of her peers who had slowly dropped out one by one, unable to bear the physical and emotional burden. For Azaleen, however, the idea of living a life on her back and opening her legs for some knuckle-dragging idiot was a far worse fate than a few years of pain and suffering. And if she was being honest with herself, Azaleen couldn't quite understand how anyone could give up, considering how high the stakes were. By the time they had passed all their trials and completed their training, there were only a dozen or so girls left, including Azaleen. She stood tall and proud, no longer a thrall, but a free woman, a shield maiden recognized for her skill, strength, and resilience. And among those who stood next to Azaleen was Yelena, another girl from her village she had grown up with. The two's bond was forged in the fires of their village, a kinship that had endured the wicked enthrallment of their people and the grueling years of the shield maiden trials. Yelena, much like Azaleen, had also refused to succumb to the fate that their captors had intended for them. Even during the darkest of times, the two became a beacon of hope for each other and reminded each other that there were worse fates awaiting them should they fail. With the ceremony for their ascendance in full swing, Azaleen stepped forward to claim her sword and shield, symbols of her new status and freedom. A deep sense of accomplishment and pride swelled inside of her as she glanced at Yelena, who shared the same triumphant look. But as Azaleen reached out to take her sword, she felt herself starting to stir awake. The vivid dreams of her past were slowly fading, replaced by an odd sensation on her chest. It felt as if two tiny feet were jumping up and down on top of her. As her awareness returned, Azaleen's eyes fluttered open to spot a small scowling face with flames for hair and two glowing violet orbs for eyes. "I think this one's broken," the small being said, stomping on Azaleen's chest once more before turning away. "We should throw it away." Azaleen's eyes went wide in horror as she stared at the small figure on her chest. A fairy, a real heaven's damned fairy, was perched right there on top of her chest, seemingly inspecting her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. The creature's fiery hair and glowing violet eyes appeared almost ethereal yet undeniably real as it stood there, pronouncing judgment on her. The sudden appearance of such a mystical and dangerous being was as horrifying as it was surreal. Especially when Azaleen's mind was still clouded from whatever concoction those strange humans had given her. "Yana, leave the elf alone." A familiar and derisive voice leaked out beside her, albeit in a language she couldn't comprehend. "You can't tell what the great Yinayinu is to do," the fairy exclaimed, her tiny voice filled with indignation. "Apostles aren't supposed to order their goddesses around." Still lying ramrod straight, Azaleen remained as still as possible while her body tensed and her mind raced. The presence of such a whimsical and formidable being filled her with a sense of dread. Fairies were often regarded as capricious and powerful creatures, never to be engaged with, let alone trifled with. The fairy stood defiantly with and authoritative as the being stared down what Azaleen assumed was the owner of the voice. However, the man once again spoke up, but this time with a slightly more assertive tone. "Yana, if you don't leave her alone, I'm taking away the beef jerky." A look of both shock and offense spread across the fairy's face as she took a step back and placed a hand on her chest. A gasp of horror left the malicious creature's mouth as if she had been mortally wounded. Fine. Fine, be that way," she yelled back, punching both hands down towards her side. "Maybe you should go find another goddess then. Maybe go worship that stupid blood god or whatever," she bellowed with a voice tinged with indignation. With a huff, the fairy kicked off Azaleen's chest and flew away. Still in a state of shock from the bizarre encounter, Azaleen finally realized she had been holding her breath. Sucking in a huge gulp of air, the blonde woman then began to heave as her face turned a deep shade of red while she attempted to regain her composure. Knowing better than to think of the being gone, Azaleen quickly sobered up and sat up, frantically scanning the surroundings in search of the mythical creature. For a moment, Azaleen thought herself safe when she couldn't spot a sign of that fiery head, but she suddenly froze. There, sitting atop a strange green mass of metal, were a pair of glowing violet eyes, glaring daggers at her with an intensity that could only be described as malicious intent. Azaleen's heart skipped a beat as she locked eyes with the tiny, nefarious creature and froze. The fairy was almost camouflaged by the setting sun peeping through the swaying leaves, casting a warm, golden hue over the entire area. The serene atmosphere contrasted sharply with the earlier tension as the soft chirps of birds echoed in the background, and a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves. Azaleen couldn't help but stare. "Mouth agape is this?" Yinayinuyua threw one leg over the other and looked downwards in annoyance, but a heavy sigh next to her snapped her out of her reverie. Flinching away, Azaleen quickly snapped her head toward the sound and took in the sight of that strange healer named Elijah or something. A look of exhaustion and annoyance colored the human's face as he walked towards her, rolling his eyes. The man acted as if dealing with such a powerful being like a fairy was a common, albeit tiresome, occurrence. "Don't worry about the fairy, she's just being moody, because I made a joke the other day," Elijah said, handing a strange bag to Azaleen that had a spoon sticking out of her. A distinct humph sound came from the direction of the fairy as she snapped her head to the side in a huff. It was clear that the being was still miffed about this joke. But despite the menacing demeanor that was standard amongst the fae, it was evident that this one was more petulant than threatening. Thank you." Azaleen mumbled in uncertainty as she accepted the bag from the supposed healer. Raising an eyebrow, Azaleen examined the contents of the bag as the aroma of cooked meat and herbs wafted to her nose. She cautiously peered inside and found a steaming hot dish that she couldn't recognize. The food looked nothing like the fare she was accustomed to in her own world. It was a mix of colors and textures that were both intriguing and foreign to her. Elijah, noticing her hesitation, offered an encouraging smile. "It's beef stew," he explained. "It's good, I promise. We figured you might be hungry after." He started rotating his hand in a beckoning fashion as he tried to think of the words in her language. "After the fuckin', the everything." Azaline's eyes flickered between the bag of stew and Elijah while her stomach growled audibly. However, she couldn't quite shake the wariness that clung to her like a second skin. The food's foreign appearance and overpowering tang of spices made her hesitant. Back in the north, anything unfamiliar often harbored hidden dangers or tricks, especially when offered by strangers, or worse, the Fae. However, the rich aroma emanating from the bag made it nearly undeniable, and slowly, Azaline brought a spoonful of this stew to her face and sniffed cautiously. A strange look then flashed across Azaline's face as she took in the unfamiliar, yet not unpleasant blend of herbs and spices. There was something not quite right about the mix of earthy and savory scents that tickled her senses. It was off-putting. With her stomach rumbling a second time, urging her to set aside her suspicions, she finally took a cautious bite. The flavors were a complex melody, rich and hearty, but something in the back of her mind nagged at her, suggesting this was not typical fare. "Take a bite, it won't hurt you," Elijah said, trying to reassure her. "You need food if you want to heal." "I bet she's gonna get the shits," Bennett elbowed Lister in the side with a twinkle in his eye. Lister's grin, however, spread wide across his face as he looked back at the rest of the team. "My money's on constipation. That stew's a gut bomb in disguise." It didn't take long for the team to start running a tally on Azaline's fate, but Elijah shot the men an angry glare which seemed to shut them up. Azaline, on the other hand, couldn't understand a word, but she clearly sensed that strange people weren't being malicious and just bantering. Ignoring them, the woman wrinkled her nose and in a mix of curiosity and determination, she took a leap of faith and bit down on the spoonful of stew. To her surprise, pure delight spread across her face as the burst of flavors danced across her tongue. The rich, hearty stew, with its tender chunks of beef and array of vegetables, was unlike anything she had ever tasted, and the spices, though initially suspicious, created a satisfying dish. Sure, she had much better food before, but when one was out in the middle of nowhere, sustaining themselves on dried meat held together by animal fat, then you'd think this dish was made for kings. Soon, Azaline found herself eagerly shoveling spoonful after spoonful into her mouth, the initial hesitation forgotten, while Elijah turned back to her and smiled. "See? Not bad, right?" he said while watching her virtually inhale her newfound prize. With the apprehension gone, Azaline couldn't help but nod enthusiastically. Elijah huffed in amusement as he crouched down next to her and started rifling through one of the backs next to her. "Eat as much as you can. You need the energy, especially if you're healing," he said, watching as Azaline continued to eat greedily before pulling out another meal ready to eat, MRE. Opening the bag, Elijah started to prep the heating elements while hesitantly broached a more serious subject. "You know, while we were out there in the forest, we came across a bunch of bodies not too far from where we found you," he said, creasing his brow a little. The words caused Azaline to pause mid-bite, her spoon hovering in the air as she slowly turned her head towards the healer and stared at him. "Were they, your friends?" Elijah asked delicately, trying to gauge her reaction. Azaline's grip on the spoon tightened slightly as anger crossed her features. She looked away for a moment, collecting her thoughts, before responding. "It's complicated," she said with a voice tinged with a hint of uncertainty. "Ah." Elijah nodded in understanding after putting two and two together. "I get it. I guess no matter where you are, people can be difficult," he continued, watching the tension in her hand slightly relax. "Especially with all these damned patrols and forts sitting around. Must be difficult to navigate through all that, only to have some friends turn on you." Elijah's face remained light-hearted and genuine, but he kept a close eye on Azaline's body language as he subtly guided the conversation. "It's also been pretty bad for business." Still processing the betrayal she had faced, Azaline found herself nodding in agreement. "Yeah. Ever since those Empire goons started fucking around further south of here, patrols have been becoming more intense." She sighed as Elijah handed her a new bag of food. Whatever they did pissed off the local wildlife and monsters, making everyone's lives much more difficult. Elijah scooted in closer with a much more interested and engaged look. Sounds like things are really messed up around here. And then, to top it off, those losers probably thought they could pull one over on you and get rid of you while it was convenient, huh? He continued, speaking animatedly with his hands. The man had hit the nail on the head as Azaline's eyes flashed with fury. Exactly. She growled. It's all some stupid fucking power struggle between Jadner's goons. I'm considered an obstacle, so that fat chubby fuck thought to shove a spear in my back and blame the goddamned Grove Maws. Her hands clenched into fists, reflecting the rage boiling inside her. Nodding sympathetically, Elijah maintains eye contact with the woman in order to show his genuine interest. Man, that's fucking rough. But hey, you survived, right? He said, pulling out a cookie from the MRE bag. Hey, you know what? Maybe we can help each other get past those patrols, and you can show those fucks what's what. What do you say? He offered, trying to sound as helpful as possible without overstepping. Meanwhile, a few feet away, the ODA team watched the exchange with a mix of amusement and exhaustion. Bennett, leaning against the vehicle with his arms crossed, shook his head slightly and muttered, God, he's such a manipulative piece of shit. Unable to disagree with the sentiment, Coleman stood there next to Bennett with a similar posture, nodding in agreement. Yeah, but, he is useful, and he's our manipulative piece of shit. The team leader said, glancing over at the ferry. The man has a way with words that gets people to open up. Useful skill to have in our line of work. As the conversation continued, Azaline's hands clenched into fists as she muttered under her breath, those filthy backstabbing fucks. Fucking Einar, you motherless son of a fat fuck. I'll snap your goddamn spine. Elijah glanced back at his team with a look of triumph on his face, before turning back to the elf. Ya fuck that guy, the medic said passionately as he adjusted himself. People who fuck over others, just to get a little further ahead in the rat race, can eat shit. He continued before looking her dead in the eye. I get it though, but you know, there's only one thing you can do to make yourself feel whole again. Azaline stared at Elijah with a mix of suspicion and exasperation. You're not gonna tell me to forgive them so my soul isn't consumed by the hells, or some other mystic bullshit, are you? A sinister smile spread across Elijah's face as he leaned in closer. No, he said, turning around and grabbing something behind him and putting it in Azaline's lap. You fucking kill them. Slowly. Shifting her eyes down to her lap, Azaline's eyes fell upon her old sword. The familiar weight and cold touch of the metal felt reassuring against her fingers as a nostalgic sense of empowerment washed over her as she lightly tapped the blade with her fingertip. Slowly, huh? She responded with her voice taking on a dark, contemplative tone. That sounds rather enlightening. Her sword was always a symbol of her past. A symbol of her freedom. Now however, the weapon now seemed to hold a new promise, that of vengeance. The once clear and peaceful skies of Cambridge, Ohio, were now etched with the contrails of every type of aircraft imaginable as sharp roars of engines and the thundering thumps of helicopter blades provided a near-constant backdrop to the daily hustle of the base. DuPont had seen the transformation unfold firsthand. Long gone were the HESCO barriers acting as a stopgap measure for a hastily constructed forward operating base. In its stead, a sea of reinforced concrete stretched throughout the entire region for as far the eye could see. The sandbags and makeshift bunkers had been replaced by layered defenses, rows of concertina wire in front of thick blast walls as guard towers kept a vigilant eye for any sign of activity. But the superhuman feats of the engineer corps weren't the only new addition to the Ohio landscape as the streets of Fort Sentinel hummed with the symphony of military might. The earth vibrated beneath DuPont's boots with each passing of the Canadian LAV-3 armored personnel carriers rolled down the road with purpose. Closely behind the Canadian convoy were Dutch CV-90s, with a full complement of troops, moving in the direction of the gate to start their patrol. While waiting for the armored vehicles to rumble by, DuPont became lost in his thoughts as they turned to how all of this came to be. The patrols were much more than just a show of force, they had become a necessity. Monsters and other forms of wildlife that seemed to have been ripped straight out of a video game had been regularly meandering through the rift and were starting to become a real big goddamn problem. After fighting back what is now known as the Seraphic Empire, reports from the surrounding states started to flood in. All across the eastern seaboard, cities were experiencing the same incidents. Strange creatures only found from the anomalous zone in Ohio had started popping up and began attacking the civilian population. The incidents were sporadic, but as time passed, the attacks started to increase in frequency, and with each report, the pressure on the base to plug the gap became heavier. However, in response to the savage and unprecedented aggression, a global alliance had rapidly formed. The invocation of NATO's Article 5 had been a clarion call, one that resounded beyond the usual confines of the treaty. Nations from every corner of the world had come to answer the call, presenting a unified front against the otherworldly invaders. It was a coalition forged not merely in the spirit of mutual defense, but in the defense of Earth as a whole. As DuPont moved through the base, he couldn't help but reflect on the sheer magnitude of the mobilization. The buildup of personnel and equipment around him was staggering. Every open space had been converted to accommodate the influx of military assets. Vast motor pools were lined with armored vehicles of every type, airfields were crowded with a range of combat and transport aircraft, and barracks that once housed a few battalions now teemed with international brigades. The daily life of the soldiers had been transformed as well. Training exercises were no longer routine affairs, but high-tempo operations simulating encounters with the alien threats. Language barriers were overcome out of necessity, as everything from corps and army groups, composed of multiple nationalities, drilled side by side. The urgency of their mission was a language understood by all. At this point, the military buildup became an open secret that spoke volumes about the expectations of the high command. The discussions were no longer about if, but when a counteroffensive was coming. The soldiers joked about it, the officers planned for it, and the very atmosphere of the multitude of military bases surrounding the rift was nearly bursting at the seams in anticipation. DuPont spotted his chance as the last armored vehicle in the Dutch and Canadian convoy rolled past, and bolted across the road just before an even longer column rumbled by. Behind him, the ground trembled anew as the mechanical growl of engines of Type 89 infantry fighting vehicles, escorted by the imposing presence of Type 90 main battle tanks from Japan, commanded the road. "Goddamn. Every fucking body is here," DuPont murmured under his breath as he turned and continued his trek to his barracks. The Japanese were not the only Far Eastern allies making their presence known on the base. No, throughout the months, DuPont had noticed that even the Korean, Australian, and New Zealand military personnel and their distinctive equipment were present in the multinational coalition. Korean K2 Black Panther tanks rumbled alongside Australian Bushmasters, their robust frames a familiar sight on the training fields. New Zealand's forces, though smaller in number, were no less significant as they joined in the field exercises in their LAV-3 variants called the New Zealand Light Armored Vehicles, NZLAV. But with a shake of his head, DuPont turned around as his mind was still trying to process the sheer magnitude of firepower concentrated in such a small area. As he made his way back to his barracks, the bustle and hum of the base surrounded him, creating a vibrant mosaic of uniforms and languages. Every NATO member state was represented, each contributing its unique strengths to the joint effort. DuPont passed by a group of German soldiers conversing with their British counterparts while Polish soldiers hurried past. Even the Swedes were moseying around, staring curiously at their corn dogs they'd bought from a food truck not too far away. The two blonde women gave each other a disturbed yet interested look before tentatively taking a bite. Initially, their expressions were a mix of skepticism and regret, but soon their faces softened into pleasant surprise. The initial hesitation gave way to genuine enjoyment as they took another bite, clearly finding the American snack more palatable than they had anticipated. As DuPont approached, he couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at the sight. "You two make it look like you're eating a stick of shit," he abruptly said, causing the two to jolt in surprise. Surprised, the two women looked up and noticed DuPont's incredulous expression as they continued to chew. "Hey DuPont," one of them said, her accent tinged with a Nordic lilt. "We just thought of trying a quintessential American, delicacy," she added after finishing her latest bite. The woman speaking was Astrid, her platinum blonde hair was tied back in a neat ponytail that swayed gently as she spoke. Her companion, Elsa, a dirty blonde, had her hair styled in a pragmatic bun, giving her a more stern appearance. DuPont couldn't help but chuckle at their choice of words. "Delicacy, huh? I guess that's one way to describe a corn dog." Elsa finished her own bite and smiled. "We've already tried the tacos here. They were quite good, actually. We've decided to try and eat our way through as much American cuisine as we can, while we can." Astrid nodded in agreement, her expression serious yet with a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Who knows when we'll get the chance again? At any moment we could be thrust into the heart of battle." DuPont raised an eyebrow. Right. Just be careful with some of the stuff they serve here. Not everything's as good as it looks." The two women let out an easygoing laugh. We'll take our chances, Astrid replied with a grin. We survived the deep-fried ice cream and the chocolate-covered bacon, so what's the worst that could happen? Taken aback by the admission, DuPont's widened and blinked slowly as he tried to comprehend what would compel someone to put any of that garbage near their mouths. As a matter of fact, if it were up to him, DuPont would have its creator and those propagating such blasphemous abominations hanged for crimes against humanity. Who in their right mind would think of heresy? Deep-fried ice cream and chocolate-covered bacon? Seriously? Pinching the bridge of his nose, DuPont chuffed in a mix of amusement and exasperation. Just try not to put yourselves in the hospital, okay? The two girls laughed as they gave each other a knowing look. We'll try our best. Anyways, I've got to head out. My superiors are summoning me, DuPont said, rolling his eyes in a good-natured manner. Duty before deep-fried horrors, I guess. Elsa playfully saluted. Good luck with the brass. Astrid waved him off. Take care. Don't let them bully you too much. As DuPont turned to leave, he caught the tail end of their conversation about their next culinary adventure. What about Buckeye balls? I heard they're a big thing here in Ohio, Elsa mused, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Astrid's curiosity piqued. Buckeye balls? That sounds interesting. What are they? They're like peanut butter fudge balls, partially dipped in chocolate. The conversation faded into the background as DuPont continued on his way, shaking his head. Looking around at the rest of the soldiers enjoying their food or engrossed in their own conversations, he couldn't help but think about Astrid's words. She was right, at any moment they could be in full battle rattle rolling across the fields and through that rift. And if DuPont was honest with himself, he wanted nothing more than that. Heaving a sigh, DuPont made his way through the makeshift food court. He noticed the area was a melting pot of cultures. Groups of soldiers from various countries were gathered around the food stands, enjoying their meals as they enjoyed a brief respite from the near-constant exercises and drills. The lively chatter of multiple languages blended together, creating a harmonious cacophony that resonated with what DuPont could only assume was what they'd find on the other side of that strange tear in reality. Just as he left the bustling area, DuPont noticed a group of Japanese soldiers had their eyes wide with both amazement and slight apprehension as they inspected the massive American-sized burgers in their hands. Their expressions shifted between awe and uncertainty, eliciting a chuckle from DuPont as the man spotted his destination in the distance. The building was a long, rectangular structure with a more functional, no-nonsense design that was stereotypical of an American barracks. Its beige walls and green roof made one nearly puke at how bland it was. The structure was almost suffocating with its utilitarian nature, a stark contrast to the lively and vibrant atmosphere of the food court he had just left. However, as DuPont approached the barracks, he noticed a few unusual details that set today apart from the usual routine. There were military police (MP) stationed outside, standing ready and alert, with their rifles hanging from their slings. Additionally, the lieutenant spotted a couple of black sedans parked just outside the entrance. Their sleek and polished exteriors looked distinctly out of place against the utilitarian and military backdrop and suggested DuPont was in for much higher-ranking personnel or officials than he anticipated. Slowing his stride, DuPont came to a stop as he took in the scene. A mixture of apprehension and curiosity flowed through DuPont as he made eye contact with one of the MPs, and in return, they watched the lieutenant carefully. As DuPont continued his approach, one of the MPs stepped forward, blocking his path. "Halt, sir," they said, after spotting his rank on his uniform. "This area is currently restricted. May I see your identification and orders?" Slightly taken aback by the fact his barracks had become restricted, the lieutenant reached for his ID, feeling a twinge of nervousness mixed with irritation before presenting it. The MP's eyes flicked up from the ID to DuPont's face, then back down as he kept cross-referencing the information. "Lieutenant DuPont, is it?" the MP asked, his tone slightly softening but still maintaining professionalism. "We have orders to only allow personnel with specific clearance due to the high-ranking officials present." A twitch of frustration flickered across DuPont's face as he furrowed his brow. "This is MY Barracks, and my superiors have literally told me to come here at this specific time. Can you check with someone inside?" Narrowing his eyes, the MP, still holding DuPont's identification, glanced at his colleague with a hint of uncertainty. There was a brief, silent exchange between the two before one of them reached for their radio, pressing the push-to-talk button. "We have a Lieutenant DuPont here requesting access to the barracks." Claims he's been summoned by his superiors, he relayed into the radio, his voice steady but slightly questioning. There was a pause as the MP listened intently to the response with an unreadable expression while DuPont stood there, a mix of impatience and anticipation building within him. The seconds stretched out, feeling longer than they actually were until the MP finally spoke up again. "Yes, sir." "Understood, sir." The MP responded as he moved to the side. With a much more relaxed demeanor, the other MP handed DuPont's ID back and stepped aside as well. "Apologies for the hold-up, Lieutenant. You're cleared to enter. Please head straight to the briefing room on the second floor, they're expecting you." A strange look flashed across the lieutenant's face as he quickly retrieved his ID before offering the two men a curt nod. "Thank you," he said almost questioningly as he made his way inside, unsure what to make of what was happening. When he stepped inside, the usual clamor and activity that came with the daily life of a barracks were conspicuously absent. The halls were eerily quiet, with only the faint echo of his own footsteps accompanying him, and the atmosphere seemed somewhat surreal. The interior was typical of what one might expect of military accommodations and was designed more for efficiency than comfort. But still the soldiers of Bravo Company had managed to give the off-white nondescript walls some life while still straddling the line of regulation. While DuPont walked down the halls lit by fluorescent lights, he noticed everything was left slightly ajar. Everywhere he looked were various personal items like half-eaten food, drinks, and other various trinkets were either left out or hastily stowed away. It was as if the occupants had been interrupted mid-task and told to promptly fuck off. To the side, in the common area, he also noticed that the massive flat-screen TV was left on, showing a lone, unmoving figure consistently being beaten by a monster. Scattered about were signs of hasty departure, a half-played card game, a phone with a video playing, a coffee mug still steaming slightly. As DuPont continued his ascent up the stairs, the signs of a hasty departure became even more apparent. The stairwell typically echoed with the sound of banter and boots, but this time he was greeted with only silence. However, when he reached the second floor, DuPont's sense of unease deepened. The corridor leading to the briefing room had a group of soldiers who didn't bear the typical military police designation. As a matter of fact, these men didn't bear any insignia at all and stood in a more casual and relaxed manner. Yet, there was an air of confidence and professionalism about them that suggested they were used to high-stakes situations, and they seemed significantly more dangerous than some MPs. Even the equipment they carried wasn't standard issue. DuPont noted the advanced communication devices that were worth more than his car, their sleek, compact weapons, and the state-of-the-art plate carriers. These were not ordinary troops, they were clearly part of some spook unit that demanded him to keep his questions to himself. Approaching the briefing room, the soldiers outside the briefing room glanced at DuPont with unreadable expressions as they sized him up. One of the operators, a tall figure man with a stern yet composed demeanor, stepped forward slightly. "Lieutenant DuPont," the operator asked in a voice that managed to be both authoritative and inquiring. With his stomach tightening in knots, DuPont nodded, trying to mask his own apprehension. "Yes, that's me. I was told to come here for a briefing?" "ID?" the tall man requested, extending his hand. DuPont quickly produced his identification, handing it over to the operator. The man inspected it closely, his eyes scanning every detail before handing it back with a nod of confirmation. "Mike, check him," the operator said, turning his head back to one of his comrades. The man named Mike, someone managed to be simultaneously stocky and a giant of a man as he stepped forward. He let his short-barreled rifle hang from its sling and began to pat DuPont down. It wasn't his height that made DuPont comply so fast, it was the fact that he was built like a brick shithouse. He felt like this undoubtedly seasoned operator could lift him up with one arm and veritably toss him out of the window if he chose to do so. So DuPont decided that raising his arms in complete compliance would dramatically decrease the odds of them deciding to use violence. As the stocky giant conducted his check, DuPont's mind raced with possibilities and worries. He wondered if this had anything to do with his men, had one of them crossed a line they shouldn't have? The presence of those rabbit girl things on base had been a constant source of distraction, and DuPont couldn't help but worry if one of his soldiers had gotten in trouble. Did one of them force themselves on one? Did someone get seduced and turncoat? Did someone give something they shouldn't have away because he couldn't keep his dick in his pants? The possibilities were endless, and all of them were blasting through DuPont's mind like a firehouse. The thought of one of his men being seduced and potentially compromising them all to treason was enough to almost give him a heart attack. He's clear, Mike finally said, stepping back and giving a brief nod. DuPont lowered his arms, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering tension. The tall operator, now identified by his name tag as Lieutenant Commander Smith, gestured towards the door with a tilt of his head. With a brief nod towards the door, the tall operator stepped to the side. "All right, they're waiting for you inside, Lieutenant," he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement after witnessing the multitude of panicked expressions flash across DuPont's face. Giving the men a curt and somewhat robotic nod in response, DuPont basically threw himself through the door. Once inside, he found that his mind still swirled with thoughts as he looked around inside the briefing room. The atmosphere was charged with a palpable sense of gravity as high-ranking military officers in their crisp uniforms and several officials in sharp suits turned around to look at him. But what really caught DuPont's attention was the presence of a rather striking figure, a petite woman with long, flowing silver hair that cascaded down her back. Her skin was almost translucently white, giving her an otherworldly appearance. But what was most unusual were her ears. Both of them stretched almost as long and wide as her forearms. As the woman turned around, she took in the sigh of the lieutenant, showing him her ethereal beauty and brilliantly bright eyes as they stared at him expectantly. The room was silent for a moment and the air thick with anticipation. All eyes were on DuPont as he stood there, momentarily taken aback by the surreal scene before he finally came to his senses. "Wait. Aren't you?" DuPont's voice trailed off as he started to recall that unmistakable face all those months ago. Isaelle studied the man before her intently. His features were unfamiliar, yet something about his presence sparked a distant memory. The tone of his voice, as he started to speak, resonated within her, igniting a sense of recognition that she couldn't quite place. It wasn't a clear or concise memory. It was more like a shadow flickering at the edge of her consciousness, but it was still compelling enough to make her believe that this was the person she had been seeking. "Wait. Aren't you?" As the man's words trailed off and he sunk into his own thoughts, Isaelle's own mind began to race. "I believe that I am," she said, looking back at Toivonen, who simply nodded as she stood there with her arms crossed. Taking a step forward, Isaelle extended her hand toward the man, her gesture one of both curiosity and diplomacy. "Isaelle," she introduced herself simply, her voice carrying a melodic quality that seemed to resonate within the room. The man, still battling with the fog of confusion, hesitated for a moment before reaching out and taking her hand. He still had a deer-in-the-headlights look, and the words were still stuck in his mouth, but Isaelle didn't seem to mind. A soft smile spread across her face as she decided to lighten the mood a bit. "This is the standard greeting for the humans of this world, right?" she asked with a regal and inquisitive demeanor. "Oh, shit dash. I mean, I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, squeezing her hand firmly and shaking it. "Lieutenant DuPont, ma'am." DuPont replied respectfully as he stood at attention. Isaelle's smile broadened, which caused her already radiant features to brighten after hearing Lieutenant DuPont's formal response. Lieutenant. Mr. DuPont." She let out a small, musical giggle, filling the room with a sense of warmth and ease. "Forgive me, I'm unable to pronounce that word yet. But you don't have to be so formal with me, Mr. DuPont," Isaelle continued with an amused tone. "Just a few months ago, I was nothing more than a mercenary with ill intentions, albeit one who was tricked into harboring them." Taken aback and unsure what to do, DuPont glanced briefly over her shoulder at the high-ranking officers in the back of the room, seeking guidance on how to proceed. However, he was only greeted with a stern and gruff look, and DuPont's eyes quickly landed on the part of the officer's uniform that harbored his rank. And he saw so many goddamn stars that he thought he saw a constellation. Not only that, the officer's expression offered no clear direction, so DuPont turned back to Isaelle, deciding to continue the conversation as normally as he could under the circumstances. With his head spinning, DuPont decided to brave the dangerous waters he found himself in. "It's no problem at all, ma'am," DuPont responded, trying to sound as reassuring as possible. "And I must say, you're doing exceptionally well with the language, given how recently you must have started learning it." Isaelle's eyes sparkled with a mix of pride and gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. DuPont. I have been trying my best to adapt and understand your world better." The room fell into a brief and awkward silence following the exchange, and DuPont could feel the weight of so many eyes on him. And each of them could ruin his life with an errant thought. With the stakes so high, he became acutely aware of every move and sound someone made. As the anticipation grew too much, DuPont opened his mouth to break the silence, but Azael spoke up first. You must be wondering why we have, well, I have called you here, yes? Her voice softly rang out. DuPont nodded, relieved that she had broached the subject first. Yes, ma'am. He replied as the officers and officials behind the elf looked at each other. Momentarily shifting her gaze away from DuPont, Azael's eyes scanned the room and looked at the high-ranking officers and officials as a brief flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before turning back to DuPont. After a few moments, her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out as a strained and almost pained expression flashed across her face. In an attempt to regain her composure, Azael took a deep breath and steeled herself. Mr. DuPont, she began, her voice slightly wavering, I have a question that has been weighing on my mind since I arrived in your world. The lieutenant's expression turned attentive. He started to sense the next few questions would impact her heavily, so he needed to choose his words carefully. Are you, the one who saved my life? Azael asked, her voice barely above a whisper as her brilliant eyes searched his. The question caught DuPont off guard, his mind racing back to the events that had transpired. He remembered a chaotic battle and the crazed werewolf-like monsters that rampaged through the streets of New Philadelphia. Yes, I was part of the team that found you, DuPont finally responded, his voice steady but still cautious. We found you wounded in the basement of a liquor store. As Azael listened, her expression remained neutral yet deeply contemplative. The acknowledgement of his role in her rescue seemed to prompt another line of inquiry, and one that appeared to be crucial to her understanding of what took place. After a brief pause, she continued her questioning, was there anyone else there with you during the rescue? Her voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of urgency hidden within it. A large man, perhaps? Wearing a white and blue gambeson, with short dark brown hair and a short, full beard? DuPont's brows furrowed slightly as he recalled the scene. The memory of the battle was still fresh in his mind as Vivid recalled the small kobolds and medieval-style footmen rushing their positions. One moment, his team was in control, mowing down waves of enemies at an intersection, the next, they were nearly overrun by crazed werewolves that tore through their ranks like a hot knife through butter. No static position was safe, and they were forced into a position of constant retreat, despite the support from Bradleys and Abrams. Each enemy wave seemed to have a response to whatever they threw at them. 1 minute one of their tanks would obliterate an advancing enemy element, only to have some chuckle fuck with a stick knock them out or get a mobility kill. Yeah, I saw a man fitting that description, DuPont said as he started to recall the specifics of that fateful day. We engaged a couple of those werewolves, or beast men if you will, that ran into the liquor store, he started, pointing towards Azael. That you were sheltering in. Azael nodded, encouraging him to continue. Her eyes held a mix of apprehension and a need for understanding, urging DuPont to reveal more about the events that had led to her rescue. Well, we managed to neutralize one of the creatures as it entered the store, but, DuPont took a deep breath as he gathered his thoughts. But the other one, it got away from us initially. We chased it to the back and that's when we heard a scuffle. He paused for a moment, shifting his gaze around the room, before continuing. There was a man, fitting the description you gave, DuPont continued, he was wrestling with the creature, trying to prevent it from getting into the basement. It was subconscious, but Azael's hand slid to the hems of her coat and gripped tightly. Even as her face maintained a semblance of neutrality, her eyes began to narrow as she braced herself for what she was about to learn. Continue. Azael said in a barely audible voice that was laden with an intensity that filled the room. DuPont paused, observing the tension in her voice and body language. The man, when we approached him, he was already badly hurt, barely conscious. DuPont explained, his voice maintaining a professional and clinical tone. But he pointed towards the basement door. Azael's breath hitched slightly, her anticipation palpable. I didn't understand his words, but his intention was clear. I'm pretty sure he was begging us to save you. His last act was to ensure your safety. DuPont continued, but when he opened his mouth to finish, the words hung in his mouth. At that moment, a palpable shift occurred in Azael's demeanor. Her grip on the coat tightened further, and the air around her seemed to thrum with a strange and arcane power. You must tell me the fate of that man, she demanded with an uncharacteristic forcefulness. Taken aback by the sudden intensity in her tone, DuPont hesitated. It was almost imperceptible, but he could sense something lingering in the air, something very old. There was a heavy silence, one that seemed to stretch on, as everyone waited for his response. Ma'am, DuPont began, his voice measured but tinged with a hint of caution. After we eliminated the threat, we turned our attention to the man, but he had already expired. A hush fell over the room as the gravity of DuPont's words settled in. Isaelle stood motionless, her eyes reflecting a storm of emotions, grief, gratitude, and a profound sense of loss. Her hand slowly released the grip on her coat, and she took in a deep, steadying breath. I see, she said quietly. Isaelle nodded slowly, her gaze distant yet filled with a newfound resolve. Thank you, Mr. DuPont, for sharing this with me, she said before turning around to the litany of high-ranking personnel behind her. I will tell and teach your scholars everything I know about the arcane, Isaelle announced, her voice now carrying a tone of purpose. I will teach them the principles of every spell I know, how I manipulate magic, and every ounce of experience I have gained over the 2,000 years of my existence. The room reacted with excitement as the officers and officials exchanged glances and started murmuring amongst themselves. The potential knowledge Isaelle offered could be a game-changer in the ongoing conflict in terms of planning and mitigation. But, Isaelle continued, her voice growing firmer, I have one more request. All eyes snapped to her as the room fell silent once more. Toivonen, who had been observing the proceedings with a keen eye, stepped forward and nodded to indicate she was listening. I wish to find Gideon's body and give him a proper sending, Isaelle stated, her voice resonating with a deep respect and solemnity. He deserves at least that much. Toivonen turned to speak with a general in hushed whispers, and after a brief exchange, she looked back at Isaelle and nodded. We will fulfill your request to the best of our ability, the intelligence officer assured her. I apologize for speaking out of turn, mistress. But I believe these attacks to be a distraction. In the lavishly decorated war chamber of the Seraphic Empire, Duchess Varasha, a regal and imposing dragonkin noblewoman that presided over the meeting in the heart of Alden Shore. The Duchess boasted an exotic plumage of red feathers that covered her body and gave her a majestic and intimidating aura. Each feather seemed to shimmer with a life of its own that reflected her status and also represented the fiery nature of her spirit. And with that fiery spirit came a fiery personality. All of Varasha's advisors seemed to flinch and shrink as her smoldering glare floated across the room as she slowly and deliberately turned her head. Her hateful gaze passed over each soul present, boring into the sun elves, the feathered and scaled dragonkin, and even the humans that acted as her council. But it wasn't until the Duchess' eyes settled on an ashen-colored female commander with ears as long as a high elf, long powerful legs, and a succubus-like tail that was signature among the Tauri tribes of the far south. The Tauri woman's long golden hair seemed to bounce as she looked down while her bright yellow pupils shook and pitch blackness of her scare widened. Commander Sestri, I do not recall allowing such a lowly barbarian permission to speak. The Duchess hissed angrily as her clawed hands sunk deeply into the wood arms of her chair. I'll give you only one chance to explain yourself. The commander nearly jumped out her skin at the Duchess' words. She should have known better after seeing how livid she was about her peers' incompetence, but Sestri firmly believed there was a lot more at play than a mere probing attack. Why, your grace, Duchess Varasha, Sestri began, her voice a smooth and deep voice seemed to reverberate throughout the chamber, my intentions are not to overstep but to provide insight that may be critical to our strategy. Her eyes flickered up and down repeatedly as she maintained a lowered posture. Duchess Varasha's feathers bristled with barely contained rage, yet her interest was piqued. A noblewoman of her standing was not one to ignore potentially valuable intelligence, even if it came from an unexpected and traditionally less respected source. I believe. Sestri continued, but hesitated briefly. I believe that the recent attacks on Count Zyrathral's border forts are not simply probing attacks to test our defenses, but are part of a larger, more calculated effort. Suddenly a loud crack rang out, interrupting Sestri's words as Varasha's fiery eyes bore into the Tauri commander. Enough of this dithering. Varasha barked as the once grand arms of her regal chair snapped in half. The advisors flinched and sent their own glare at the barbarian as a low growl left their Duchess' mouth. Speak plainly, Commander Sestri, or I swear by the ancestors I'll have you and your filthy tribe set to the flame. Sestri's heart raced, but she knew the importance of her observations. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Why, your grace? Sestri started to speak hastily. The attacks were too precise, too controlled. They weren't just testing our defenses, they were creating openings. And I suspect their true goal was to send small groups of scouts or harassers through these gaps to wreak havoc behind our lines, to distract and divide us further. As Commander Sestri spoke, a Sun Elf advisor stood tall, with an air of arrogance that only centuries of life could imbue. His expensive and ornate robes were a cascade of fine silks, shimmering with the symbols of his esteemed position as he looked at the Towery with contempt. Bah, what nonsense! What evidence do you have to support such an outlandish claim? He demanded, his eyes narrow slits of derision as he focused on Sestri. The War Council seemed to rally behind him, nodding and muttering in agreement, their disdain for the Towery commander's theory apparent. Lady Varasha, with all due respect, I once again protest against letting this slave near your presence, let alone speaking amongst those far above her slovenly station. Sestri, feeling the pressure of the room's doubt and hostility, struggled to maintain her composure as her head snapped to each advisor with a look of horror on her face. Her voice trembled slightly, but her resolve did not waver. The locations of the attacks. The manner of their execution. None of it makes sense for a mere probing attack, she asserted. Another member opened their mouth to give another verbal lashing when the Towery spoke up louder to continue justifying her opinion. The forts they targeted weren't strategically valuable. They were poorly positioned and even more poorly constructed. Sestri marched forward and jabbed her finger onto the massive map that highlighted the location of every unit, every fortification, and every supply route. See? They're surrounded by dense forests that limit visibility and movement, and they're too close to the Druids' forest. Besides, this is Sestri tried to get out one more point, but was interrupted by Varasha. The very same ploy you and your damned people used against me. Varasha finished Sestri's sentence as her memory went back to the campaign to pacify the Towery tribes and the necropolis in that god-forsaken desert, causing an involuntary shiver to pass through the room. The Duchess's face was a mask of fury, her feathers practically standing on end as her piercing gaze swept over her council. And that damned ignorant and arrogant fool Zyrathril had more than likely let them through, if you're correct. Varasha slammed her fist down onto the table, making several advisors flinch. Korthax was a damned fool for putting him in charge of the vanguard. The idiot has left us too exposed, too vulnerable, she spat out, her voice dripping with venom. That buffoon allowed a mere probing attack to put 3 of our dragons out of commission, and an entire flight of wyverns killed. The Duchess's tirade continued unabated, her voice rising with each word. And our so-called emperor? Varasha bellowed, causing everyone in the room to stiffen, a greedy, power-hungry tyrant, never satisfied and constantly reaching far beyond his means at the expense of others. Her words were sharp as daggers, and the tension in the room was palpable as she cursed the Emperor's name, an act that made everyone look away, half in fear, half in disapproval. She paced back and forth, her feathers flaring with each step. I wouldn't be surprised if this was another one of his tricks to rid himself of anyone he deems troublesome, she hissed, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. The world would have been better off if the filthy half-breed had been a stillborn. A hushed gasp went through the room at the Duchess's blasphemous words. One of the seraphic advisors, a tall, slender sun elf with a face etched in worry, finally spoke up, his voice meek but carrying a tone of reprimand. Your Grace, that is too much. Please, consider the implications of such words. Varasha halted in her tirade, her chest heaving with each breath. She had been dragged out to the middle of nowhere to act as a figurehead, a supreme commander with no real power. They had set up the command structure with politics in mind, where her peers got to execute the defense of the outer territories however they wished, organizing themselves while leveraging her reputation and finances. Varasha didn't even have the authority to prevent the infighting and was left to clean up the mess as imperial armies even burned the villages and sometimes small towns of the vassal states. Her role was a cruel joke, and she legitimately thought this was a means to kill her through political machinations while the incompetent enacted their own agendas under the guise of her command. Every victory was theirs, and every failure was hers to bear. Her military acumen and years of command reduced to nothing but a title, paraded in front of the masses and the nobility alike. I want constant patrols screening us and those incompetent fools, Varasha finally said with an almost defeated voice as she sank back into her chair, the remnants of her once grand armrests lying forgotten on the floor. If Commander Sestri and the reporting from the expeditionary force were to be believed, then every patrol must maintain a minimum 10-meter spread and 1 mage in each squad. The Duchess then placed her clawed hand on her face to cover her eyes and heaved a depressed sigh. Gods! How much longer do we have to keep walking? Talarian grumbled as he and Rivka made their way through a vast field of green chest-high grass tipped with golden wheat-like heads. The field seemed to stretch out like what seemed like an endless sea around the two as every so often a gentle breeze would blow in, relieving them slightly from the overbearing heat. The sun hung oppressively in the clear blue sky like a relentless orb of fire that seemed to suck the moisture right out of the air. "We should have been in Aldenshore by now," Talarian groaned, wiping the sweat from his brow with a dirty sleeve. "It's just a day's travel." Rivka let out a long, drawn-out sigh with a tired voice tinged with annoyance. "It's a day's travel on horseback, not on foot," he corrected while his gaze remained fixed on the seemingly endless stretch of grass. The STYMPH's arms hung limply at their side as he heaved one hot breath after another as his discomfort started to edge near unbearable. Rivka's body was not designed for such prolonged exposure to intense heat. Without the ability to cool himself like a lot of the mortal races in the realm, the sun became much more dangerous. Normally, his nomadic kind would usually travel along bodies of water during the summer months, taking advantage of the cooler environment and the ability to submerge themselves should they get too hot during their travels. However, as they made their way northward, Rivka had decided against traveling along the waterways, fearing they might inadvertently stumble upon a patrol or attract unwanted attention. It was a calculated risk, one that prioritized their safety over personal comfort. But now, as the sun scorched the earth and the vast field offered no shade, he was beginning to second-guess that decision. "Okay, but," Talarian's voice droned on, blending into the background hum of the world as Rivka focused all his energy on putting one foot in front of the other. The STYMPH's thoughts were foggy as his head started pounding with the onset of heat exhaustion. Every step felt heavier, every breath hotter and more arid than the last. But he couldn't stop, they had to keep moving. In a moment of desperation, Rivka reached to his side and fumbled for the waterskin hanging from his belt. With shaking hands, he brought it to his lips and tilted his head back, gulping down the precious, life-giving water with a greed born of necessity. The cool liquid was a balm to his parched throat, offering a momentary relief from the relentless sun. For a brief moment, as the water trickled down his throat, the world seemed to stand still. Rivka closed his eyes, allowing himself the smallest respite, feeling the water revive him slightly. But as the waterskin emptied, the harsh reality of their situation settled back upon him. That was supposed to last him a lot longer. Rivka's mind raced as he tried to conjure up a map of the area in his head. There had to be some source of water nearby, a pond, a creek, anything to get some relief from this oppressive heat. But the land around them offered no such salvation. There were just endless fields of gold-tipped grass swaying under the sun's brutal gaze. The poor man couldn't help but hang his head in regret, wishing that he had taken the time to more thoroughly scout the area, but there was just no reason to. It was just endless fields and roaming herds. As the sun elf behind continued to complain, Rivka felt as if he was starting to go insane. But suddenly, Talarian let out a frustrated groan as if he made the worst mistake of his life. "I should have just married what's-her-face ugly daughter and stayed in my shithole village." The words struck Rivka like a bolt of lightning. He snapped his head towards Talarian, his eyes wide with a sudden realization. He reached out, grasping Talarian's shoulders and giving him a vigorous shake. "You're a genius," he exclaimed, startling Talarian. "There should be a village. It sprang up not too long ago, not far from here," Rivka continued, his voice quickening with excitement. Talarian, taken aback by the sudden intensity, met Rivka's gaze with a bewildered expression. "What? A village? What are you on about?" he asked, trying to pull away. Rivka's grip tightened momentarily as he almost shook Talarian in his excitement. "Yes, a village. I remember spotting a few new settlements a few months back during a scouting mission." "They weren't too far from here," Rivka insisted, his voice a mix of hope and determination. "We can rest there, get out of this sun, and more importantly, get resupplied." Talarian, still a bit dazed from the shaking, rubbed his shoulders as he tried to process the sudden change in their situation. "Oh. I thought you were suggesting something about marrying an ugly country bumpkin for a moment there," Talarian said, scratching his head. "No, you fool," Rivka replied, quickly getting behind him and pushing the man along. "Didn't you say you helped the commander extort those villages a few months ago? Come on before I drop dead from this goddamned heat." Rivka barked, forcibly urging Talarian along and nearly causing the elf to trip. A scowl formed Talarian's face as he stumbled forward before regaining his footing. With irritation clearly etched on his face, he spun around and growled. Why the hell am I supposed to lead the way? Talarian shrugged Rivka's grip off and flailed his arms violently. Aren't you a scout? You're the one who's supposed to know where everything is. Scoffing in retort, Rivka rolled his eyes and gave Talarian a harder shove, saying, yeah. Just get a move on and lead the way. Surprised by the shove, Talarian tripped backwards, but managed to spin and catch himself as he stumbled forward. Throwing his head over his shoulder, the elf glared at Rivka while muttering a string of curses under his breath, but relented and started walking. It's this way. For hours the two continued their trek, the sun climbing higher into the sky as its rays became increasingly unforgiving, and when it reached its zenith, marking the hottest time of the day, the heat intensified. Even Talarian, who was much more resilient to the heat than a STYMPH, started to feel his own strength waning with each step. The harsh conditions showed no mercy, and it became even more evident when he glanced back at Rivka and saw that he had fallen behind. The STYMPH was struggling to put on foot in front of the other and looked as if he might collapse at any moment. Talarian broke out into a run and quickly closed the distance between them before grabbing onto and steadying Rivka. Hey! Don't keel over just yet. Talarian exclaimed as he examined his partner. The STYMPH's face was drawn with exhaustion, his skin paler than usual, and his breathing ragged. Without hesitation, Talarian pulled off his water flask and with trembling hands, Rivka reached out and weakly gripped onto the water skin before desperately bringing it to his lips. As Rivka drank, Talarian couldn't help but frown. Rivka's usually vibrant feathers, which on any other day would flutter and move animatedly on their own, now lay limp and scalding to the touch. Each feather, a unique and typically lively extension of Rivka's being, felt as if one could cook an egg on it. Under normal circumstances, STYMPHs could manipulate their feathers in expressive and practical ways, often using them to communicate or express themselves. And much like hair for humans or elves, these feathers grew long and full, most reaching down to their lower back. But now, the heat had turned each of Rivka's feathers into a furnace, trapping heat close to his body and exacerbating his condition. How much farther do we have to go? Rivka murmured weakly between labored breaths, his voice barely above a whisper as he leaned heavily on Talarian. Talarian, maintaining a firm grip on Rivka, tried to exude a confidence he didn't feel. The truth was, he was just as uncertain about their location and how much further they had to travel as Rivka. He remembered the general direction that the commander took to get to the cluster of villages, northeast, towards the Dwarven Mountains. His gaze constantly swept the horizon and saw that the grasslands offered little more than the occasional tree or rock formation. Every feature seemed to blur together, creating a landscape of unending waves of golden-headed grass. Panic began to gnaw at the edges of his mind. Had they veered off course? Was his memory failing him? The possibility of them being hopelessly lost started to drive him mad. But just as despair started to tighten its grip, something in the distance caught his eye. Distinct, dark tendrils snaked up into the sky, outlining themselves against the clear blue. There. Talarian pointed, his voice cracking with a mix of hope and urgency. Smoke, do you see it? That's got to be the village. After gulping down the remainder of Talarian's water, Rivka felt a massive wave of relief wash over him. The water did little to alleviate the oppressive heat, but it was enough to bring his world back into focus. Lifting his head, Rivka narrowed his eyes and utilized his keen sight to discern the rising smoke. However, a great sense of unease started to twist in his gut. Wait. Rivka murmured, his voice strained but urgent. There's too much smoke. That's not normal, Dash. It's probably just them burning the summer fields or something. Talarian cut Rivka off by yanking him off the ground and dragging him along. Plus, we don't have much of a choice anymore, you drank all the water. A yelp left Rivka's mouth as felt himself be yanked forward. Snapping his head up to glare at Talaroin, Rivka opened his mouth to protest, but the words failed to come out. Not only did he not really have the energy to argue, but he couldn't really disagree with the elf's assessment. They didn't have a choice. Even if there was a feral dragon setting every peasant aflame, their lack of water and growing exhaustion left them with little choice but head towards the source of the smoke. But as they neared, it became very apparent that the source of the smoke wasn't some kind of summer burn. No, the village itself was being devoured by flames as thatched roofs and wooden pillars sent columns of smoke into the sky. With each step forward, the air slowly became thick with the smell of burning wood and something far more acrid, the unmistakable scent of charred flesh. The shrill screams and cries of agony piercing through the occasional crackling and popping of the fire confirmed their worst fears. This was no accident nor a controlled burn. It was an attack. In the heat and haze of the day, as the relentless sun bore down upon them, Rivka's keen eyes caught the distinct movement of several men on horseback patrolling the outskirts of the burning village. They moved with purpose, likely acting as a screen to intercept or hunt down any fleeing villagers or unwanted witnesses. "Horsemen!" Rivka yelled, a note of panic in his voice as he pointed towards the rapidly approaching riders. "We need to run." But before he could take even a step, Talarian's firm grip on his arm stopped him. "No." Talarian hissed, locking eyes with Rivka. "Even if we weren't exhausted, we wouldn't outrun riders, especially not in this open field." Rivka's heart pounded in his chest as the reality of their situation settled in. They were out in the open, exposed and vulnerable. The riders, likely screens for the raiding party, quickly started to close the gap. Talarian's grip on his falchion tightened, his knuckles whitening as he recognized the colors and emblems of the riders as they came into focus. It was a noble house he had ridden with before on many expeditions to pacify the countryside and acquire supplies from the villages and towns in the area. Lord Saraller's retinue, a noble house well known for its horse breeding and aggressive tendencies. And Talarian knew mostly all of the skirmishers that rode this side of the territories, so it looked like he was going to have to talk his way out of this one. As the riders closed in, Talarian stepped forward, his stance defensive yet open, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Hail, men of Lord Saraller," he called out from across the field, raising a friendly hand. "By the gods, am I glad to see you." The riders' hard gallop started to slow as they took a much less aggressive approach as the lead horseman, a rugged-looking and sun-kissed human with a weathered face and eyes sharp as a hawk's, squinted at the two mountless interlopers as he approached. His horse, a massive chestnut-colored stallion, snorted and pawed at the ground, agitated by the smell of smoke and chaos. "Tal? What the infinite hells are you doing out here?" the horseman called out with a tone mixed with surprise and suspicion. He eyed Rivka, who had uneasily hid behind Talarian, and looked away nervously. "I figured you dead like the rest of Count Harmswood's boys on the border," the horseman continued, his expression softening slightly but still guarded. "What you doin' with a damned stymph? Talarian, masking his nerves under a well-practiced facade, responded with a blend of half-truths and omissions. "Gods, you wouldn't believe it, Raf," he said, pulling off his kettle helmet and running his fingers through his unkempt hair. "The stymph and I were the only survivors of that god's forsaken attack." Black horrid flying beasts swooped out of the sky spitting fire and death, carrying strange men who descended from their bellies on ropes. "We barely made it out with our lives." He casually left out the part where they had fled at the first sign of trouble, knowing full well that admitting such cowardice, even if it was the smarter choice, would have them hung as deserters. The horseman named Raf seemed to mull over Talarian's words, his gaze shifting between the two survivors. After a moment, he nodded slowly, as if accepting the explanation, albeit with a hint of doubt. "Truly? The only survivors?" he asked gruffly. The fort was slaughtered to nearly a man and it looked like they barely had enough time to even leave their post. Raf's skepticism was evident in the way he scrutinized Talarian, his brow furrowed, and his eyes unyielding. The horseman was no stranger to battle and how surviving one that went as bad as those forts was very unlikely. But he knew Talarian was a resourceful and conniving son of a bitch, so it was completely out of the realm of possibility. "I know you, Tal. You're a survivor, always have been," Raf said, though the underlying tone suggested he was aware of Talarian's less than noble characteristics. "And I know better than to take everything at face value, especially with you." He paused for a moment, then continued, "But ain't for me to judge," Raf said, squinting his eyes as it roamed the field. "Your fort ain't the only one that got attacked, them otherworlders are lurkin' around these parts attackin' supply caravans and pickin' off commanders." Talarian's brow furrowed as he processed Raf's words. The casual brutality of the situation made him uneasy, but he knew better than to show any hint of disapproval or shock. Instead, he forced a neutral expression, knowing full well the kind of ruthless measures often employed in war, especially under a lord like Saraller. He glanced over at Rivka, who was doing a good job of hiding behind him, and then turned his attention back to Raf, nodding slowly as if understanding the gravity of their circumstances. Did the otherworlders attack this village? Talarian asked, gesturing with a subtle nod of his head towards the burning wrecks and the distant, yet still audible, screams of agony and despair. Raph let out a dark chuckle, the sound grating and devoid of any real humor. Nah, this is all Lord Soralo's doing. Gotta deny the enemy any respite, you know? Torch the villages, kill the peasants. Make sure there's nothing left for those otherworldly bastards to use against us. And, well... Raph's smile turned into a knowing smirk, a bit of fun while we're at it, right? Soiled peasant girls go for a pretty bit of copper, hell your pretty STYMPH goes for several silver if you're sellin'. Pretty sure a few lads are into the girly boy types. The callousness of the comment made Talarian's stomach turn, but he masked his disgust with a tight-lipped nod. He'd heard similar justifications before, brutal strategies aimed at crippling the enemy by any means necessary, but the reality of it all was always a harsh pill to swallow. Still, he knew arguing or showing any sign of weakness or dissent wasn't an option, not here, not now. Nah, I still need him to find my way around. Talarian replied, his voice low and steady. But I get it, it's a cruel world out there and the auxiliaries don't pay much. Gotta make coin somehow. A hearty chuckle left Raph's mouth and nods. I thought you only chase after the curvy ones. Didn't take you to plow tiny half-breeds. He looked Rivka up and down and nodded. I ain't gonna blame you, though. As Raph continued to demean and harass Rivka, the subject of the discussion felt a surge of indignation. As he remained hidden behind Talarian, the STYMPH's feathers bristled with a mixture of fear and anger at the offense. However, his survival instincts and better judgment forced him to swallow his pride and stay silent. However, their conversation was soon interrupted by the sound of more hooves thudding against the ground. Talarian, Rivka, and Raph all turned to see another group of riders approaching. Leading them was a figure who exuded both authority and arrogance. The man sat upright and held his head high in an insufferably prideful way as he strode forward. Commander Ilarion, Raph said with an exhausted sigh. Try not to say nothin' stupid. Bastard's the seventh son of a damned baronet, but acts as if he's the first son of a duke. He said as the tall, upright sun elf gnome rode towards them with an air of self-importance. As the commander drew closer, Raph straightened up, his demeanor changing from casual to a more respectful stance. Commander, Raph lowered his head in deference. I'd like you to meet Talarian and his guide. He quickly introduced Talarian and Rivka to the commander. The two are survivors of the fort attack and, the horseman recounted the story, conveniently omitting the part about Talarian's less than reputable nature. Commander Ilarion regarded Talarian with a cold, disdainful look, his lip curling slightly in disgust. Survivors? Why did you not fall with the rest of your unit, like a proper Imperial? He accused, his voice dripping with contempt. Cowardice is a stain upon the Empire, and you, along with that disgusting harpy hiding behind you, are no exception. Ilarion's words were like daggers, and Talarian felt the weight of his gaze and judgment. Sir, we fought valiantly, but the situation was hopeless. We were tasked to bring what information we could. Talarian tried to get out, but the commander scoffed and cut him off. Huh? Hopeless? Intelligence? The commander sneered, with his hand gripping the lance in his hand. You sound more like deserters. A true Imperial soldier would have died with his comrades. You should be lashed, if not hung, for your cowardice. Talarian's face twitched as he moved his body in a more defensive posture. See, Commander. With all due respect, we have invaluable information about the Otherworlders and we witnessed their capabilities firsthand. Our superiors tasked us with. As Talarian desperately tried to make his Rivka tried to remain as inconspicuous as possible. The STYMPH's every instinct screamed at him to flee from this perilous situation and his stress levels were going through the roof. Rivka then momentarily closed his eyes and took a deep breath, attempting to calm his frayed nerves and slow his heart to regulate the heat, but as he focused, a strange buzzing noise caught his attention. It was barely perceptible against the backdrop of the surrounding chaos, but it was there. Monotonous and alien. Rivka's eyes snapped open, and his sharp vision focused on the small black dot in the sky. A horrible foreboding feeling started to swell with the STYMPH's chest just like back in the fort as he stared at the strange and unsettling object as it just floated there. Unmoving and unnatural. The thing was mostly a reticular shape with 4 arms with 4, things spinning impossibly fast. As if the sight alone wasn't unnerving enough, Rivka felt as if the object was observing them, studying them. Just like how a hawk watched its prey to calculate the best approach. However, just as Rivka opened his mouth to say something, his head snapped to another object that he just so happened to catch at the corner of his eye. There was another black object, but this one was different, longer, faster, and it was coming directly at them. Without a second thought, Rivka's survival instincts kicked in. He reached out, grabbing Talarian's hand with a vice-like grip and yanked him hard. "Run! I knew it! Traitors!" Commander Alarian bellowed, snapping his head towards Raf and pointed at the two running deserters with his lance. "Bring those cowards to heel. They shall rue the day they turned their back on the Empire." Caught off guard by the situation, Raf sat there on his horse, momentarily stunned as he watched Rivka and Talarian sprint away. His head snapped back and forth, between his commander's enraged shouts and the fleeing figures of what he had thought were at worst stragglers. With a frustrated click of his tongue, the gruff skirmisher finally made his decision after a few scant seconds of hesitation. He knew the consequences of disobeying an order, especially one barked by someone as frivolous and flippant as Commander Alarian. Jabbing his heels into his mount, he spurred the horse forward, rallying his men with a sharp command. "After them! Don't let them get away," he shouted, as he jolted forward. 5 of the 15 horsemen broke off from the main group to give chase. The pounding of hooves resounded as the horses galloped after Rivka and Talarian and quickly closed the distance. The riders themselves seemed to be as amused as they were bewildered by the fact these two even entertained the thought to run, let alone actually make a break for it. Fueled by adrenaline and confusion, Talarian glanced over his shoulder and stared at the charging cavalry with a mix of fear and disbelief. He couldn't help but wonder what in the hell had just happened. What prompted Rivka to suddenly take off and drag him along? Did the commander spook him? Did he just panic? Talarian's mind raced in an attempt to make any kind of semblance of sense of what just happened, but every thought running through his mind was abruptly cut short by an ear-splitting blast. A bone-rattling shockwave hit Talarian and Rivka, causing them both to stumble off their feet and eat the dirt. The commander and a few other men who had been standing around him were the target of the blast, and all of them, including the horses, crumpled to the ground. Chaotic and terrible screams filled the air as a voice cried out in agony and utter disbelief, "The commander's dead. Gods preserve us! What in the infinite hells was that?" More riders started convening on the epicenter of the explosion, trying to make sense of what just happened, but they were only greeted with both panic horses and men. All they knew was that an explosion had claimed the lives of 3 and left 4 others sprawled on the ground, trying to manage their wounds. Their leader's body was strewn haphazardly as he and his mounts stared lifelessly at the sky. "Calm yourselves. Form up!" Raf shouted 20 or so meters away as he struggled to regain control of his startled steed. The remaining riders, though shaken, seemed to respond to Raf's command, albeit with visible hesitation. They shuffled around, in an attempt to control their own steeds as they did their best to follow orders while their eyes darted around in search of any further threats. "I said form up. Get into ranks." Raf bellowed as he looked down towards Talarian and eyed him with suspicion. "Tal. What the fuck was that?" Still sprawled on the ground from their fall, Talarian and Rivka exchanged a look of shared dread before they turned their eyes to the horsemen. This was all too familiar, a haunting echo of the terrifying onslaught they had experienced at their fort. The only thing missing was the dark silhouettes of those nightmarish flying beasts and the oddly garbed warriors descending from them. Talarian hastily stood up as he pushed his kettle helm firmly on his head. The man's heart pounded heavily against his chest as he recalled the terrifying events that had transpired at their fort. "It's the same as at the fort, the explosions." They were always followed by, Talarian's words faltered as something in the distance caught his eye. His head snapped to the figure emerging from the tall grass, holding onto a large, strange object. It bore a resemblance to a crossbow, but everything about it was off, alien, and ominous. But it was the uniform that truly struck a chord of fear and recognition in Talarian. It was the same as the ones worn by the strange attackers at the fort, the otherworldly invaders who brought destruction and death from the sky. All of a sudden, the air was torn apart by a long staccato of deafening cracks, nearly as loud as the explosion that had just occurred. The tip of the figure's strange weapon spat fire like a dragon as he swept the thing across the field. Swaths of men and horses were cut down as more otherworldly monsters appeared, their strange weapons spewing death in every direction. The once orderly field was now a nightmarish landscape, with the once proud and disciplined riders thrown into disarray and terror. While his instincts were screaming at him to seek cover, Talarian looked to Raph and the other horsemen gawking at the scene. "Get down," he bellowed, spotting the otherworlder with the larger weapon turning his deadly gaze towards them. The air around them seemed to tremble as the deafening long string of cracks erupted in their direction. Without hesitation, Talarian threw himself to the ground, pressing his body into the dirt as flat as he could as the world around him vibrated from the otherworldly barrage. A cacophony of hisses and snaps were punctuated by the yelps and cries of men, and the panicked neighing of horses resounded in every direction. As heavy thuds of the horsemen and their steeds falling echoed around him, Talarian clenched his teeth and shut his eyes tight as he gripped his cattle helmet tightly. The man did his best to curl himself as small as he could in an attempt to use his pitiful helmet as a shield to protect him from the horror unfolding around him. But as quickly as it came, it left, with a slew of pained curses and the frantic neighing taking its place. The crackles of strange weapons and screaming still dominated the field, but it was no longer directed solely at them. Cautiously opening his eyes, Talarian realized that the immediate danger had passed, but the battle raged from all across the field. Mustering his courage, he began to crawl through the grass, moving toward the sounds of struggle and pain. As he approached the source, the image that met them was one of pure carnage. Raph lay trapped beneath his thrashing horse, his armor punctured in several places, each wound oozing blood. His face was a mask of pain, yet his eyes burned with a fierce determination to survive. He struggled, pushing and wriggling in an attempt to free himself from the weight of his dying mount. Talarian and Rivka exchanged a glance, knowing they needed to act fast if they were to help Raph in any way. Without a word, they moved to his side, each taking a hold of the horse in an attempt to lift it off him. The task was Herculean, the horse's spasms of agony making it difficult to get a good grip. "Raph!" Talarian called out, his voice laced with urgency. "Hold on, I'm going to get you out." Raph's labored breathing was the only response they got as he continued to push against the ground in fruitless attempts to slide himself out from underneath the animal as it thrashed. And as Talarian came up to him and started yanking, the two managed to make some progression. But it wasn't until Rivka approached that they actually started making some headway. The STYMPH quickly surveyed the situation and racked mind racing for a solution beyond brute force. With a deep breath, he began to chant in a melodic yet powerful language that seemed to resonate with the air itself. "Karitha Sarandalikian." Rivka's voice reached a crescendo, and as he uttered the final syllable, he extended his arms towards the horse, palms facing outward. A visible shockwave of force erupted from Rivka, hitting the horse with a concussive push. The animal, caught off guard by the sudden burst, was lifted slightly and pushed away, freeing Raph from its oppressive weight. "By the gods!" Raph gasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What just happened?" He looks down and starts undoing the straps of his armor with shaking hands. Panic started to take hold of the gruff warrior as he pulled his armor off and saw a flood of his own blood gushing from his torso. The punctures in his chest and stomach were far more severe than he could have ever imagined. No bolt or arrow was capable of creating such wounds. The man's hands immediately went to cover the holes in a pathetic attempt to stop the blood from pouring out. "Oh gods! Oh gods!" Raph's rugged face contorted in pain and horror as he frantically pressed his hands against his abdomen, but no matter how badly he wanted the bleeding to stop, it just gushed through his fingers. As Raph's breathing became erratic from the blood filling his lungs, Talarian and Rivka watched in shock and despair, knowing that even with a healer the horseman was most likely dead. The man was basically drowning, and even if a healer got to him, there wasn't a spell powerful enough to mend wounds that looked like they'd been hit by a damned needle demon. Raph's eyes were wide with terror as he looked up at them, trying to shout over the cacophony of strange weapons. Tal, you gotta help me," he pleaded through gurgled coughs. "Tal. I can't die here." Talarian sat there, frozen in horror, as the deafening cracks of the otherworldly weapons echoed in almost every direction. In a panicked haste, he crawled forward, his hands trembling as he tore open Raph's tunic, flinching away at the sheer volume of blood that gushed forth. The small piece of cloth had been acting as a dam and now released a flood, showing the full extent of Raph's wounds. The ghastly punctures were so deep and numerous that they left Talarian feeling helpless and lost. He glanced back at Rivka, whose expression mirrored his own horror and confusion as he sat there with his feathers pressed low against his head. With no knowledge or means to stem to help the man, let alone stop the bleeding, they could do nothing but sit there and gawk. Fuck, foo. Raf's eyes went wide open as he attempted to gasp for air, but only gurgled. Tal, I can't breathe. I can't. Slick with Raf's blood, Talarian's hand shook as he stared at the horror of the situation. Raf's pleas for help and gasping breaths filled with gurgles of blood seemed to have had paralyzed him in that very moment. The once rough and assertive man was reduced to a trembling, mewling mess. But suddenly, the rustling of grass broke through his morbid trance. Talarian, fueled by fear, whipped out his falchion and pointed it towards the source of the moment, praying to whatever god that would listen that it wasn't one of those horrible beings. Sergeant! A call screamed out as a limping figure burst through the grass. Talarian and Rivka both couldn't help but heave what was more like a gasp of relief as another skirmisher, clutching onto a mage's blade staff and his own wounds. But as his eyes landed on the scene before him, his shouts died in his throat. Sir, the man stammered, lowering his blade staff as he took in the gruesome scene. Sergeant! No longer capable of forming words, Raf could do nothing but flail and gurgle as his lifeblood continued to pool beneath him and in his lungs. The man's eyes went wild with panic and pain. Struggles became weaker, more sporadic as he grasped at his wounds. It wasn't long until Raf's movement stilled, his eyes fixing on some unseen point. Everyone remained still, staring at the horror they just witnessed until in a fit of rage, the mage stood up grasping onto his staff and pointed it in the direction of the chatter of otherworldly weapons. In a desperate bid to retaliate, the mage stood up to his full height and began to chant. Isha Vintil, Pyrai Astu. His words filled with a strange power and seemed to pull at the very fabric of reality around him, and a small orb of fire then began to form in air with each uttered syllable. The mage's eyes swung to his target, several of those demons sprinting across the field while another contingent covered their maneuver with those infernal weapons barking incessantly towards his compatriots. As the mage focused on his incantation, his gaze fixed on the distant figures bolting through the grass. However, he struggled to get a proper fix on these monsters in the form of men. Their uniforms were unlike any he had seen before, their forms broken up by the strange foliage-patterned uniforms that made them blend seamlessly with their surroundings, making their silhouettes only intermittently visible. Coupled with the way they moved through and how they kept their head down, made it nearly impossible for the mage to target with a precise fireball. Meanwhile, the target that the mage had focused on popped back up with his horrible weapon roaring back to life. A continuous thunderous rattle tore through the air as the fearsome weapon turned towards a contingent of auxiliary reinforcements that were rushing to the aid of their beleaguered allies. However, the reinforcements were caught in the open and were unprepared for the onslaught that was to come. Bunched together, tightly in a formation, large swathes of the reinforcements were mercilessly cut down. Each burst of their weapons spelled the death of countless men, leaving the once orderly ranks in disarray and panic. A repeated series of cracks rang out as Talarian and Rivka watched as the mage's head snapped back and watched as the man crumpled to the ground as if he were a puppet with his strings cut. Crawling over to the man, Talarian looked down and nearly puked at what was left of the newest victims of the Otherworlder's face. And what was worse, the poor man was still alive, garbling something unintelligible as his hands moved to where his jaw was supposed to be. We need to get the fuck out of here. Talarian looked over his shoulder, back at Rivka as he scrambled away. We need to get the fuck out of here right fucking now. Talarian's command was all Rivka needed. In a frenzied state of panic and survival, the STYMPH didn't hesitate. He spun around up and began to crawl away from the horrifying scene, keeping his body as low to the ground as possible. But as he moved, his eyes caught sight of the mage's blade staff a few meters away, discarded like an unwanted item. Without a second thought, Rivka grabbed it, remembering he had lost his own during his getaway in that fort attack. But just before he had made it out of eyeshot, Talarian's voice rang out once again. Wait! The Sun Elf yelled after seeing his companion loot the blade staff. In a moment of quick thinking, Talarian had spotted something else of value. He quickly rose to his feet and ran towards the fallen horse, his body hunched to make himself a smaller target. And after reaching the beast's corpse, Talarian's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope as he saw the massive water skin still attached to the creature's side. With a few quick slices of his dagger, he cut it free. And none too soon, because just as he pulled it free, the ground around him and the mangled mage was peppered with several weighty thunks. Deciding he wanted absolutely nothing to do with whatever in the hells that was, Talarian decided that what he managed to grab was enough and basically sprinted after Rivka, ducking and weaving through the grass. And it seemed that Talarian's instincts had never been sharper. His decision to just grab what they needed most was validated mere seconds later. As he and Rivka made their hasty escape, a multitude of bone-rattling and deafening blasts erupted behind them. Talarian held his breath as he glanced behind him and saw a sight that sent a chill down his spine. Go. Keep moving. Talarian shouted out to Rivka when he saw the STYMPHS head turn to look. They didn't have time to gawk. Their only chance to get out of this hell was to put as much distance between themselves and these demons as possible. Because he was more than certain that they'd be coming to check for any that still breathed sooner or later. Rivka didn't need to be told twice. He clutched the blade staff tightly and ran like the very hells were chasing him. Because, as far as he was concerned, they were, and they took the guise of men with green faces. Coleman and his Operational Detachment Alpha, ODA, team moved like specters through the unusual grass field, creeping closer to the village in the distance. As the team leader looked around, his gaze couldn't help but linger on the curious blend of foliage around him. It was neither entirely wheat nor typical grass and stood almost chest-high while swaying gently with the breeze. The heads of each large blade were slightly broader than the wheat fields of Middle America with an odd mix of golden and green, but they sure did catch the sunlight in a way that gave the field a shimmering, almost ethereal quality. Turning his attention back to his mission, Coleman continued to stalk forward with his team, their forms barely disturbing the grass as they advanced. They had silently observed the tragic scene unfolding in the village. The mounted scouts' brutality inflicted upon the villagers had not gone unnoticed. These men were not simply soldiers performing their duty, no, these were marauding animals that needed to be put down. The team had initially debated the best approach to engage these mounted scouts. Their scattered patrol pattern was a problem and could lead them to be decisively engaged. It was a situation where the assaulting element could be flanked and overrun. However, as fate would have it, an opportunity presented itself when the scattered scouts converged on two individuals who had unwittingly wandered toward the doomed village. Now, the once dispersed and difficult-to-target screen of enemy scouts was clumped together, focused on their prey, unaware of the danger that lurked within the grass. It was the moment the team had been waiting for, and when everyone was in position, a singular word left Coleman's mouth as he pressed down his push-to-talk. Execute. Suddenly, just above the largest cluster of horse riders, a switchblade drone came in screaming and detonated above their head. The explosion showered everyone in the immediate area in shrapnel that tore through metal and flesh just before a concussive blast that threw both the men and horses alike to the ground. A brief and stunned quiet filled the air before the cries of the injured and the panicked neighing of horses echoed throughout the field. Coleman watched as more riders rushed to the scene of the blast to lend any aid they could, but little did they know this was a fatal mistake. And this was the moment the ODA team had been waiting for, a singular moment to capitalize on the confusion and disarray. Without being prompted, Lister suddenly rose from his position in the grass, pointed his -48 Malawian Quatch's belt-fed machine gun at the group, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon went cyclical, its relentless chatter ripped through the air as the man swept across the field, mowing down everyone and everything foolish enough to remain standing. At the same time, Coleman, Elijah, and Bennett were quick to follow Lister's lead. They rose from their cover and began sprinting towards a better vantage point. As they moved under the cover of Lister's deadly barrage, their own suppressed weapons snapped up and barked to life as they engaged targets of opportunities. The muted thumps of their shots dropped individual enemy soldiers alongside Lister's machine gun's heavier, more rhythmic bursts. But suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, Coleman watched as Elijah suddenly stopped as a small and feminine voice spoke up. "Kill that one." Yana grabbed Elijah's short beard and yanked on it before pointing towards a soul-standing figure in the middle of a field. The man was conjuring a small but growing ball of fire just above his head, and without hesitation, Elijah raised his rifle and squeezed off several rounds in the direction of the mage. Several bullets found their mark as the mage's body jerked and his head snapped back violently. However, just before the mage collapsed back into the field, he managed to get the spell off. In a split second, Elijah managed to duck down and evade the projectile, but he couldn't say the same for his goddess. Yana had shifted her attention to Lister and watched with glee as the man opened fire once more, shredding an entire formation of foot soldiers rushing to aid their fallen comrades. And as the fireball closed in, Yana finally turned, and her eyes widened. In an almost whimsical manner, the fairy winked out of existence just as the fireball reached her and allowed it to detonate harmlessly away from them, engulfing a swath of the field in flames. As the intense heat from the fireball sang the air and licked at his skin, Elijah quickly rose to his knees as a slew of profanities left his lips. The curses seemed to complement the staccato of intense gunfire as the man quickly reached up to his chin, fumbling with the strap of his helmet. With an audible click of the buckle, the helmet subsequently sprang off, revealing a flailing fairy underneath, her tiny form creating a chaotic whirlwind in his hair. "God damn it, Yana!" Elijah shouted in frustration as he watched her flutter off, seemingly equally agitated by the tight confines. "Bah! Stinky!" Yana spat as she glowered down at Elijah. "Wash your hair, brute!" For a fraction of a second, Elijah could only stare at the tiny being in irritation as he quickly snapped his helmet back onto his head. With everything secured in place, Elijah dug into his pocket and pulled out a fragmentation grenade. "Frag the fuck," he angrily yelled as he looked at Bennett and pulled the pin from his grenade. While Elijah and Bennett were busy tossing their grenades, Coleman continued to pick off individual footmen and riders, trying to regroup methodically. His weapon consistently barked out death with every pull of the trigger. After a few seconds, the dual explosions from Elijah and Bennett's grenades reverberated across the plains as the supporting element of the ODA team continued to suppress the main bulk of the enemy. With the mage neutralized, the assaulters renewed their push towards a small hill that provided a decent view of the village and its surrounding lands. Within the village proper, the occupying forces realized their screen had failed to repel whatever attack was occurring and started to prepare their response. Once Elijah, Bennett, and Coleman reached the hill's zenith, they watched a mass of over 100 men hastily rush out armed with a colorful variety of weapons and shields. Organizing the rabble into a real fighting force, several individuals of what looked like their leaders or officers ran up and down, barking at the men to form cohesive blocks. Bennett was the last to get to the top when he took a knee and started firing his weapon at figures in the field. He glanced over his shoulder towards the village and couldn't help but scoff. "Wow, Eli. It's like one of those shitty animes you watch," the engineer said before he returned to picking off survivors of their ambush. "I still haven't seen a catgirl yet," Elijah responded as he peered through his optic. As the two men started their banter once more, Coleman let out a huff of amusement before gazing up at the RQ-28A quadcopter drone hovering high in the sky. Pressing down on his push-to-talk button, he communicated with their fire support team. "Baron 3, this is Baron 1, you got me?" he said coolly as sporadic rifles and machine gun fire echoed in the background. A brief moment of static crackled through the comm before Baron 3's voice came through, strong and clear. "Roger that, we got eyes on you and the massive infantry." Coleman nodded to himself in satisfaction before narrowing his eyes at the enemy formation. "Don't open up on them yet," he instructed firmly. "We're gonna lure 'em in. Wait for my mark." An affirmation to the order came over the radio just as Coleman switched frequencies. "Lister, get up here. Schwartz, Jacobs, keep playing whack-a-mole and keep up the overwatch." Lister, the team's weapons sergeant, weaved through the tall grass like a predator. As he approached the team, he brought his hand down onto Coleman's shoulder, signaling his arrival without a word before taking a knee. Meanwhile, Coleman continued to observe the enemy formation with a keen eye. Among the infantry blocks, one particular group on the flank caught his attention. Unlike the disciplined formations commanded by stern officers, this block on the edge was noticeably less organized. The soldiers within this group appeared lax, their formation loose and uneven, and even the officer in charge of this block seemed less focused. "There," Coleman suddenly spoke up with a low but firm voice. "Lay into those fucks. Make 'em tighten up their formation." A devilish smile spread across Lister's face as he nodded. He quickly approached a nearby rock formation, deployed the bipod on his -48 Malawian Quatches, and prepared the belt-fed machine gun for the barrage he would soon unleash. And with a squeeze of the trigger, the plains erupted into a cacophony of violence as Lister unleashed a torrent of lead upon his unsuspecting victims. The rapid bursts, barked out as a hail of deadly projectiles, arced across the sky and into the ranks of the lacklustered soldiers. "Wow, get fucked," Elijah said in awe as he watched men who weren't quick enough to hide behind the glowing shields or were too slow to react topple over. It wasn't long before gaps in the main body of the formation started to close up. Officers barked orders as they tried to regain control over the situation, and any imperfections their soldiers had were quickly rectified as they watched their flank be decimated. The horrible sound of Lister's machine gun, coupled with hisses and snaps of supersonic bullets, sent knots of fear into the guts of many, especially after seeing their beleaguered flank die like flies. But despite the terror and confusion, the disciplined corps marched forward even in the face of such strange and alien firepower. "Nice, that's what you like to see," Coleman shouted before fiddling with his radio and pressing down on his push-to-talk. "Baron 4, this Baron 1, execute," he said before looking up at the drone. "Baron 3, Baron 1, for rounds each gun. Target is the main body, adjust fire as needed, over." "Baron 1, this is Baron 3. Confirming, for rounds each gun," the response returned, acknowledging that they were gauging accuracy. "Shot, over." Sinister smiles spread across every Special Forces team member's face as the machine gun continued to chop away at the enemy's flank. "Shot, out," Coleman replied. Within moments, the sound of the 40mm high-explosive grenades whistled over the heads, and the team watched as the high-explosive rounds slammed 50 meters behind the enemy formation. The rustic, medieval-like soldiers snapped their heads around as the rounds struck right behind them. As a look that said he was slightly impressed crossed Coleman's face, he looked back at his team and noted they shared the same expression. "Damn, that was fucking close for a first try," the team leader said aloud as he glanced up at the drones, knowing the team with the GMVs would be course-correcting on the fly. And the moment those thoughts crossed his mind, the radio crackled back to life. "Baron 1, this is Baron 3. Correcting, sending 4 rounds, Shot, over." Coleman's gaze fixed back on the enemy formation and waited patiently. "Shot, out," he responded. The air filled with anticipation as the seconds ticked by. Then, as if on cue, the next barrage of 40mm grenades whistled as they arced overhead, this time landing 10 to 20 meters in front of the enemy formation, splashing their shields and legs with shrapnel. "Baron 3, Baron 1. Hold that. Wait 10 seconds and send it," Coleman yelled excitedly into the radio. He knew it would take a few moments for this mass of troops to regain their bearing before walking face-first into catastrophe. When the team leader let go of his radio, he waited and watched with bated breath as he started a countdown. 10, 9, 8. The words silently left his mouth just as the enemy soldiers, in their confusion, continued to move forward, unknowingly marching into the very heart of danger. They trampled over the minor pop marks in the earth where the previous rounds had exploded, their tight and organized formation acting as an imposing bulwark. 4, 3, 2. As Coleman hit 1, his radio crackled to life once again. "Baron 3, going full cyclic." It only took a few more seconds before the air was filled with the unrelenting whistle of descending munitions. The sky seemed to rain down an endless barrage of 40mm grenades, each one a promising death. The field transformed into a scene straight out of a war movie. Explosions rocked the formation of soldiers as grenade after grenade found its mark, engulfing the enemy in a maelstrom of fire and shrapnel. The concussive blasts echoed across the plains, sending shockwaves that could be felt even from the ODA team's position. Both Elijah and Bennett narrowed their eyes and puckered their lips into an O expression as they nodded. Never in their careers had they ever dreamed of witnessing something so horrifically amazing. "Wuh, dot." Yana screamed, clutching at the mesh that lined the top of Elijah's helmet. "Beautiful. Wonderful. Incredible." But just before she finished her praises, another sound joined the din of battle, the iconic, deep-throated chops of an M2 Browning .50 cal machine gun. Everyone's head turned sharply towards the source of this new, dominating presence. Thundering through the field was a ground mobility vehicle, GMV, with its heavy machine gun mounted on top, laying waste to the enemy's flank with unrelenting ferocity. The Browning's rounds tore through shields and men alike as its rhythmic firing pattern contrasted with the explosive that showered down on top of the poor souls who only sought to flee the scene. As the vehicle came to a stop, its gunner expertly swept the .50 cal back and forth, cutting down anyone and everyone foolish enough to remain standing. Amid the carnage, Yana seemed to be overcome with joy and excitement. Her wings fluttered rapidly, causing a blur of iridescent light as she darted forward from the relative safety of Elijah's helmet. With each maneuver of the GMV and burst of the .50 cal, her excitement grew until she reached the scene. Pew! Pew! Pew. 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 Pew, her tiny, high-pitched voice chanted out with absolute glee. Darting back and forth in the air, she pointed her dainty finger like a gun at each soul felled, mimicking her soldier's actions with one eye squinted shut. Best investment ever. Then, with a sudden surge of enthusiasm, Yana zipped higher into the air, getting a better view of the slaughter unfolding below. Get him! Get him, humans, she yelled while energetically waving her tiny hands as she continued making playful gun noises. The fuck is wrong with her? Coleman suddenly spoke up as he and the team turned to Elijah. Elijah seemed to recoil from the accusatory looks as his brows furrowed, and a look of disbelief and annoyance covered his face. What the fuck? Why the hell are you asking me for? He retorted defensively. Do you think I know what's going through that psycho's head? Everyone on the hill shook their heads and turned their gazes back to the little fairy as she continued to zip around and point her fingers at the bodies with jubilant chants of pew pew filling the air. The team couldn't help but feel a bizarre mix of amusement and bewilderment. You make it sound like you're not equally as weird and fucked up, Coleman said, giving Elijah the side eye before turning away from the medic. Swapping to the team-wide frequency, the team leader then spoke into his headset. Cease fire, he barked authoritatively. Let 'em run. No point in wasting any more ammo. It didn't take long for the guns to quiet and the explosions to cease. The battlefield fell eerily silent, save for the distant crackles of fire from the village and the occasional groan of the injured or dying. The enemy, those who survived, fled in every direction, scattering like rats from a sinking ship. Even though the life-reaping had ceased, Yana's excitement hadn't dampened a single bit and was still buzzing around incessantly with energy. Meanwhile, the team had thought to convene and discuss the next steps after their little victory. They had initially launched the attack as a means of harassment, to probe the enemy's response and inflict some damage. But now, as they watched the surviving enemies flee in disarray, they found themselves at a temporary impasse. It left them scratching their heads and wondering what they should do next. When the three other GMBs joined them, Coleman looked around at his team and saw their eyes reflected the same question. Alright, you freaks, he finally said, signaling the men to close in. Any ideas or suggestions on how to proceed? Quan, the team's sergeant, had a more pragmatic answer. It sucks, but this really isn't our problem, he said as his gaze lingered over to the smoldering village. There's probably a bunch of shitbags still loitering in the place, and we'd have to sniff them out. I say we move on, continue mapping their forces, and take out their eyes and ears. A few other team members nodded in agreement, the grim reality that the surviving villagers were effectively going to be on their own to deal with whatever horrors went down in there. Their primary goal was to gather intelligence, disrupt the enemy, and survive. Not get involved with the locals and play at being humanitarians. Lister, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. I don't like it, but I have to agree with Quan, he said, but I think we need to find a rock and hide under it for a while. We were loud and did a lot more damage than we initially thought, he said, looking over to the killing fields where Yana continued to dart around doing whatever the hell she was doing. They're going to be looking to respond, and we don't want to be around when they do. His words resonated with the team. Albeit they had just struck what they assumed was a small raiding force, it was still a significant blow, and it would undoubtedly draw attention. The enemy would be looking for retribution, and they needed to stay one step ahead. Coleman glanced over at Elijah, which naturally caused the rest of the team to follow his gaze. Elijah seemed spaced out, leaning casually against one of the GMVs, lost in thought as he saw the ferry bolt down on the ground into some poor, unfortunate soul. When he finally noticed the collective stare, his face scrunched up in confusion and a hint of irritation. What? He blurted out, pushing off the vehicle and raising an eyebrow. Why the hell is everyone looking at me? The team's gaze lingered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and expectation. Quan, ever the one to bust Elijah's balls, responded with a slight smirk. Well, we'd like to know the opinion of our resident manipulative sociopath with a literal fairy god attached to him, he drawled, his gaze pointedly flicking to where Yana was still zipping around. Oh ho. Hilarious. Elijah rolled his eyes and crossed his arms. You guys are fucking comedians now? He shot back with an annoyed look. Go on, tell me another joke. Quan just threw his head over his shoulder, gesturing to the blonde-haired elf sitting in one of the vehicles, tilting her head curiously. Azaleen was aware they were talking about her and wondered what these strange people wanted. Elijah brought a hand to his face and pushed at his eyes to suppress the forming headache. Jesus Christ, you people are annoying, he muttered exhaustedly. Answer the question, asshole, Coleman replied sharply, his patience wearing thin. A pained groan left Elijah's mouth as he closed his eyes and considered the situation. After a few moments of thought, the medic finally opened his mouth. I think we should go and help the village, he said, leaning back against the GMB. Eyebrows raised, and murmurs of surprise rippled through the team. Taking the village was not just a bold move, but one that would potentially expose them to greater risk. It was wise to say this was more stupid than altruistic, but everyone here knew Elijah was everything except altruistic. So, there was another angle at play. Why? Coleman asked, his expression serious as he weighed Elijah's suggestion. They're attacking their own people, right? Elijah responded as he stretched his back out. Some friendly villages and towns could make not only our jobs, but every asshole out here's job a lot easier. When the Special Forces team entered the destroyed village, they couldn't say they were surprised at what they saw. The team kept their weapons up so they had full 360-degree cover, and the closer they got, the more apparent the devastation became. The attack on the village had been brutal and comprehensive, leaving nothing but smoldering ruins and the lingering smell of smoke and death in its wake. It was evident that a scorched earth policy was being employed by the attacking forces. Buildings were burned to the ground, stores of food and water deliberately destroyed, and livestock slaughtered or driven off. The goal was to demoralize and uproot the community completely and deny any potential resources to their enemies. As they moved further into the village, the horrors inflicted upon the villagers became painfully clear. The bodies of military-aged men lay scattered throughout, many of whom appeared to have been executed en masse. It was apparent that the occupying forces had dealt with any potential resistance quickly and without mercy. But the fate of the women was perhaps the most harrowing. Even the young had been subjected to unspeakable acts of violence and cruelty, as everyone was left bound to several carts with the look of fear and hopelessness in their eyes. As they approached, the full extent of the tragedy was displayed in painful detail. Among the ruins, they finally came across piles of bodies belonging to both men and women. A good number of them carried signs of torture or depraved abuse as they lay in the dirt lifelessly. It was clear that the attackers had not only sought to destroy the village, but also decided to have their own sick brand of fun. Fucking animals. Quan sneered as his eyes glanced over a truly horrific scene that involved young girls. Shoulda killed them all. Lister couldn't agree more. The usually stoic and composed operator was visibly shaken. He wouldn't say he was immune to the horrors of war, but this wasn't something any soldier should or would ever do. To deliberately inflict such horridness upon the innocent struck a deep chord of anger and sorrow. Christ. He muttered a mix of rage and disbelief. Same shit, different world, Elijah said almost indifferently as he and Bennett moved towards one thatch-roofed building that was still reasonably intact. A few looks glanced the medic's way. They all knew of his deployments in the Middle East and his part in eradicating ISIS. The militant group had shown him the darkest aspects of human cruelty, especially when he took part in missions that took him deep into the heart of the Islamic State. In Syria and Iraq, Elijah would have encountered scenes of unimaginable horror. ISIS was notorious for its ruthlessness, which included public executions, torture, and the enslavement of women and children. Slave markets were a grim reality of ISIS-controlled areas, where women and girls, primarily from the Yazidi community, were bought and sold like cattle. As Elijah and Bennett approached the entryway to the building, a tense silence enveloped them. But before he made his entry, Elijah took a moment to glance back at his team. We're in the wildlands now, so you guys better start getting used to this kinda stuff, he said stoically before turning his attention to the door. Bennett positioned himself on the opposite side of the door with his weapon trained on it as Elijah readied his own weapon. While carefully managing the angle and space he exposed himself to, Elijah pushed the door open and began to cautiously and systematically clear the room. To gain control of the room, Elijah moved his weapon in a smooth, sweeping motion. Bit by bit, he covered every potential hiding spot and corner of the doorway without fully exposing his body to reduce the risk and thwart anyone waiting to ambush him. As he shifted his position, Bennett mirrored his movements on the other side, from the corner of his eye. Both operators covered opposing angles, the other couldn't, ensuring a thorough and coordinated sweep of the area. As Bennett shifted his weight to get a better view into the interior, a sudden rustle of movement caught his attention. There he saw a brief glimpse of the same armor and colors that belonged to the soldiers they had decimated just outside of the village in the fields. Reacting instinctively, he squeezed the trigger, sending a few rounds into the room. The sharp retorts of gunfire were immediately followed by a surprised yelp and the sound of a body crashing into something inside. "Yep, we got dickheads lingering around," Bennett confirmed the presence of enemy forces hiding within the village. The team snapped to attention as their focus narrowed and their weapons trained on different sectors. Everyone quickly mobilized in groups of 2 to start clearing the remaining structures of the village systematically, and luckily, there wasn't much to clear. The village was small and comfortable, but would still be a meticulous and time-consuming task to clear every half-standing structure and pile of rubble. As the team broke off, Elijah peered into the darkness of his targeted building and saw the silhouettes of a handful of people lying on the floor. "Bang it," he suddenly ordered in a low and commanding tone. Bennett reached into the pouch on his chest rig, pulled out a small, metallic object, and prepped for entry. He swiftly pulled the pin, and in a practiced move, he lobbed a flashbang through the doorway. A disorienting flash and a deafening blast erupted inside the room just a few moments later, causing a few yelps of confusion from within. And the moment the explosion rocked everyone inside, the 2 operators stormed in. Bennett veered left and Elijah right, each moving to establish control over the large room. They entered swiftly and efficiently, their movements honed by countless hours of training and real-world experience. The room was quickly sliced into sectors of fire by the 2 operators, and almost immediately, they caught sight of several armored figures. They were disoriented and stumbling, seemingly caught entirely off guard by the flashbangs, disorienting effects, and the sudden intrusion. The armored man attempted to recover and let loose a spell or charge with whatever weapon they had, but it was too late. They were hopelessly outmatched and unprepared for the speed and violence of action executed by the Special Forces soldiers. An entire volley of suppressed gunfire barked out sharply in the confined space as each of the operators riddled the armored figures with bullets. Elijah's weapon quickly put down one individual near the entrance, the muffled shots hitting the armored figure multiple times in the head and causing him to drop to the ground like a sack of potatoes. Without hesitation, Elijah's gaze and weapon snapped to another armored figure deeper within the room. He unleashed a fusillade of bullets. Round after round slammed into the target, causing them to scream and flinch away before falling to the floor. Still alive and full of adrenaline, the armored man tried to escape and scrambled away desperately. However, Elijah was relentless, he kept firing, perforating the man as he tried to stand, but he ultimately succumbed to the barrage and landed face-first on the floor. At the same time, another series of suppressed barks echoed on the other side of the room as Bennett neutralized someone else. With the immediate threats eliminated, the 2 operators swiftly transitioned to a comprehensive search of the room. Unimaginably bright lights shone from their rifles as they methodically worked their way through the peasant house. The interior was as expected of a rural homestead, minimal and functional. Elijah approached an aged wooden cabinet, its doors hanging slightly ajar. He flung the doors open with a firm hand and immediately stepped back, readying his rifle, just in case someone was inside. But the cabinet turned out to be bare save for a few articles of clothes, a bow, and a few poorly made arrows leaning against the back of the cabinet, and his gaze lingered there. Something about the depth didn't seem quite right. The back panel looked shallower than it rightfully should have been. As he contemplated investigating further, the distant sounds of weapon fire elsewhere in the village reached his ears. It seemed there were a lot more of these rats lingering about than expected. "Oh damn," Bennett's voice suddenly cut through his focus, carrying a hint of triumph. "Check this out." Turning around, Elijah saw that Bennett was standing over the upturned remains of a makeshift mattress that the engineer had overturned. Bennett had a small leather pouch in his hand that rattled with the unmistakable sound of metal coins when he tossed it up in the air. A look of interest covered Elijah's face as he arched his eyebrow. He started his approach, but the sound of laborious breathing caught his attention, dragging his eyes back to the figure he had shot. The armored man was barely clinging to life, each breath a wet and gurgling struggle against the inevitable. However, Elijah's gaze then turned to the middle of the room where he saw 3 other naked bodies. A woman and what looked like her daughters were lying face up, staring lifelessly at the ceiling, covered in blood. Scowling in disgust, Elijah promptly pointed his weapon at the head of the still-breathing man and pulled the trigger. The armored figure violently stiffened as his muscles tensed one last time, before finally going limp. After a moment's pause, Elijah shook off the grim atmosphere and stepped over the now lifeless figure. He then walked over and took the pouch from Bennett's hand, feeling the weight of the coins. He shook the bag and heard the coins jingle inside, then tossed it up and caught it with a deft hand. Elijah's eyes met Bennett's, the shared look acknowledging that he was actually impressed. "Not bad," Elijah commented with a nod of approval. "Not bad at all. I don't know anything about the local currency, but it must have been hell saving this much as a peasant, serf, or whatever these people are." As Bennett's fingers rummaged through the contents of the pouch, he only saw a bunch of dirty copper coins and a scant few made of silver. But when he jostled the bag, something caught his eye, a single brilliant gold coin that glowed faintly amidst the mundane. He carefully extracted it, holding it up for the two to get a closer look. "Huh, why's it all glowy?" Elijah asked, furrowing his eyebrows in confusion as he leaned in for a better look. The coin, indeed, had an unusual luminescence that wasn't standard in any other kind of gold coin he had seen, at least not in his world. "I dunno," Bennett shrugged, turning the coin over in his fingers. "Maybe Yana can see if it's magic or something." "Where is she, anyway?" Elijah gestured vaguely over his shoulder, his attention still partly on the coin. "Outside, fucking around with our new elf and the dead," he said with a slight edge of exasperation. Something, pain, suffering, and hatred in the air. You know, fairy stuff." Bennett did not, in fact, know. The engineer stared blankly at Elijah before shaking his head. "Right," he replied, furrowing his brow. It astounded him just how quickly Elijah was able not only to adapt but somehow understand that little demon. It was as if they were on the same frequency or something. The whole situation with Yana and her peculiar bond with Elijah was far beyond his understanding. It was clear that there was more to their dynamic than met the eye, but he wasn't going to delve into it right now. "Anyways, let's get the hell out of here. This place is depressing," Bennett said, spinning around to leave. However, Elijah grabbed him by the shoulder. "Hold on," he interjected, shifting his focus to the cabinet he had been inspecting earlier. "Help me check this cabinet real quick. Something's up with it." Bennett raised an eyebrow, but followed Elijah's lead. "Yeah, sure, why not?" he said as they approached the cabinet while shouldering his weapon and shining his light into it. "Let's see what kind of surprise we get." Elijah eyed the back of the cabinet intently, his suspicions growing. The space seemed large enough to hide a full-sized person, albeit uncomfortably. He began pulling out the items from the cabinet, creating a clearer view of the back panel. "Looks like there could be a space back there," Elijah muttered as he felt around, looking the interior up and down. "Big enough to hide someone, maybe." He glanced at Bennett, who was watching him curiously. "You ready?" Elijah asked, his hand tightening around his rifle. Bennett nodded as he pointed his rifle at the cabinet. "Yep." As soon as the words left Bennett's mouth, Elijah stepped back, and with a swift motion, he slammed the butt of his rifle into the back panel. The wood splintered and cracked under the force, revealing a hidden space behind it. A pained gasp erupted from the concealed area as a figure flailed and tumbled out onto the floor. Elijah instinctively hopped back before shouldering his rifle and aiming it at the figure. Bennett also had his weapon trained on the sudden emergence, but they held their fire when they realized it was a young girl. The girl was visibly terrified, clutching her stomach as she tried to crawl away from them, holding her hand in front of her face to block out the blinding light. Her eyes squinted in pain, and her breaths came in short, panicked gasps as she felt fear consume her. She looked no more than a teenager, and her appearance suggested she had been hiding there for quite some time. "No, no, please no!" the young girl screamed with a voice filled with fear and desperation. In her frantic attempt to stand up, she stumbled over something on the floor, crashing back down with a thud. As she scrambled to get up again, she turned her head and saw the dead bodies in the center of the room. For a brief moment, she froze. A look of utter horror crossed her face when she recognized the lifeless, naked bodies. A heart-wrenching scream tore from the girl's throat when she recognized the violated and brutalized forms of her family. Her bid to escape became even more desperate as she clawed away at the ground, only to find herself in the corner of the room. Realizing she had nowhere to go, with the two men approaching, she curled into a ball, covered her face with her arms, and started weeping and pleading. The two Special Forces soldiers instinctively lowered their weapons, exchanging a brief, uncertain look, unsure how to proceed with this sudden, intense display of grief and terror. "Yeah, no. Bennett, a bit lost for words, finally spoke up, "You're the people person, you deal with this shit." Elijah shot Bennett a strange and frustrated look. "What the fuck? I'm not good at the whole empathy thing unless I'm faking it," he retorted with a voice tinged with annoyance and helplessness. Bennett gestured towards the girl with both hands in a graceful manner. "Then fake it," he replied firmly yet sarcastically. "Oh God," Elijah softly groaned as his hand came up and rubbed his eye. "All right." The medic then allowed his weapon to dangle from his chest as he raised his hand and started to approach the girl, cautiously. Kneeling down a safe distance away to appear less intimidating. Hey, it's okay. We're not going to hurt you. We're here to help," Elijah spoke softly, trying to project a sense of calm and safety. But the girl seemed lost in her own world of pain and fear as her cries drowned out his words. Elijah looked back at Bennett helplessly, silently communicating this was utterly out of his realm of expertise, but the engineer just urged him to continue with his hand. Elijah took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts on how to approach this delicate situation. He was pretty good at persuasion and playing mind games, but genuine sympathy was not his forte. The man needed to find a way to connect with the girl, to somehow break through her wall of despair. He hesitated momentarily, then spoke again with a softer tone this time around. We took care of the bad guys who hurt your family," he said, gesturing toward the corpses of the armored figures that slumped against the wall and lay dead on the floor. "They won't be hurting anyone else." As he spoke, Elijah rummaged through his pockets, looking for something, anything that might serve as a small gesture of kindness. His fingers closed around something unexpected, a half-eaten cookie. He pulled it out and gave it a strange look, remembering Yana munching on it earlier. Glancing back at Bennett, he saw the engineer's judgmental gaze fixed on him. Turning back to the girl, Elijah cautiously extended the cookie towards her. "Here," he said gently. "I know it's not much, but maybe it'll help a little." The girl, still rocking back and forth with her face buried in her arms, didn't seem to notice the offered treat as her sobs continued. Elijah felt a twinge of helplessness, a rare feeling for someone usually so in control of his surroundings. "Please," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "you're safe now. We took out all the, bandits that were attacking your village," he said softly, with an uncomfortable look plastered on his face. "You don't look hurt, so come outside and help the rest of your, friends? Village mates?" Elijah stayed in that position with his hand extended, still offering the cookies as a symbol of peace. The simple act of kindness felt strangely foreign to Elijah, yet it was the most human thing he could think of. Miraculously, the girl gradually ceased her rocking, and the intensity of her sobs lessened as she slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were bloodshot and held the look of fear, but it seemed the juxtaposition of a stranger offering a half-eaten cookie amongst horror in the room perplexed her. She still shivered uncontrollably, her gaze flickering between Elijah's face and the cookie in his hand. The room was filled with a palpable tension, the kind that precedes a pivotal moment. Elijah held his breath as the cookie that still extended in a gesture of goodwill was accepted after what felt like an eternity. The girl hesitantly reached out with a trembling hand and took the treat. "Holy shit, I can't believe that fucking worked." Bennett suddenly spoke up in the background. Elijah narrowed his eyes at the young teenage girl he had rescued from the literal house of horrors. She sat hugging her knees on a cart, her eyes bulging out of her head as she stared into the distance. He couldn't quite imagine what was going through her mind. The trauma, the fear, the sheer weight of having lost everything in such a brutal, senseless fashion. It was a familiar scene to Elijah. He had seen similar scenes in Iraq and Syria, where ISIS's reign of terror had left indelible scars on countless lives. Villages were destroyed, families were torn apart, and the haunting presence of slave markets where human lives were traded like commodities. As he looked around at the burning village, Elijah saw innumerable faces overwhelmed with a sense of deep helplessness. These were not soldiers, they were just regular people trying to live their lives, and the people charged to protect them and their way of life turned out to be their worst enemy. Fate would have it, said hostile force turned out to be the only lifeline these villagers had. Sure, the Special Forces team had ulterior motives, but they were still offering tangible help and compassion to those who had just faced the unimaginable. And Elijah was acutely aware of the complex dynamics at play. He had just finished treating one of the few surviving men who had been fortunate enough to have survived the attack. He had multiple fractures, lacerations, and severe bruising, but the man had avoided anything life-threatening. Glancing over to Samson, the team's other medic who was assisting his own patient. A young boy with a stab wound and a broken leg. Elijah called out to him, "Hey, don't use any of our supplies if we don't have to. We need to keep a handle on what we go through." When he heard Elijah's words, Samson was already digging into his advanced trauma kit when he froze. The younger and gruff-looking man froze as a scowl formed on his face. The kit contained items that would greatly assist in treating the boy's injuries, but they had to be judicious with their resources. With a mix of frustration and understanding, Samson clicked his tongue and instead applied only the most basic form of first aid, using the very primitive and equally limited medical resources available from the village's own supplies. Coleman narrowed his eyes and stared disapprovingly at Elijah. "It's a kid, Eli," he commented, his tone laced with a hint of reproach, knowing full well the kind of response he might receive. Elijah, tying off a bandage on the injured man he was working on, didn't even look up as he retorted, "Doesn't change the fact we gotta conserve what limited resources we have. Plus, we don't know how long we'll be out here." He finished securing the bandage with a precise knot and added, almost nonchalantly, "So, fuck them kids." The team leader rolled his eyes at the stark and unapologetic response. Coleman couldn't help but think he should have known better than saying anything. This kind of cold and calculating pragmatism had been a staple when it came to Elijah for as long as Coleman had known the borderline sociopath. But as distasteful as it was, the medic wasn't wrong. In his line of work, resources were always finite, and prioritizing them was part of the job, no matter how harsh it might seem. Ugh. Those stupid idiots. Yana barked in annoyance as she looked around. "It's all a mess." Yana's exasperation was palpable as she fluttered about the devastated village, her eyes a glowing violet hue indicative of her emotional turmoil. Her frustration seemed to stem not just from the physical destruction around her, but from something unseen, something beyond the understanding of the Special Forces team. "What the hell are you going on about?" Elijah finally asked with a tone mixed with concern and confusion. He and Coleman shared a look, unsure of how to interpret Yana's erratic behavior. Ignoring their queries, Yana continued her agitated monologue, seemingly addressing someone or something invisible to the human eye. "Go, stay, become a wraith, make up your mind," she yelled impatiently. Elijah turned back towards his GMB to see if Azaleen held any answer, but the woman's own gaze was a potent concoction of skepticism and discomfort. She side-eyed the fairy as if she was truly feeling something troubling as her brow furrowed in a silent, questioning alarm. Several moments passed as Elijah's gaze remained fixed on Azaleen, who seemed just as perplexed and disturbed by Yana's outburst as everyone else. Her own gaze searched for any sign of insight or understanding, but it was evident by her hard look and gaping mouth that she was equally at a loss. Turning his attention back to Yana, Elijah watched for several long moments as the fairy darted about in the sky and continued to rant and rave like a crazy person. With a shake of his head and an incredulous look on his face, he muttered under his breath, "I ain't dealing with this shit right now," before getting up and moving to his GMB. Coleman, following closely behind, chimed in with his own thoughts. "Logic dictates we should look into whatever the psycho-magic demon says, but I can't be fucked to be honest." His voice blended resignation and practicality while he sat in the passenger seat and started fiddling with the radio. "Boyer 1, this is Baron, over," Coleman began, keying the radio as he prepared to give a situational report to the signal intelligence unit hiding out somewhere and acting as a relay to higher command. His voice was calm and composed, but there was an undercurrent of weariness that hinted at the strain of the day's events. "Baron, this is Boyer 1, send your traffic, over," came the crackling response from their unit headquarters. Coleman glanced briefly at Elijah, who was rummaging through the bags near Azaleen, before he continued. "Boyer 1, we're pivoting to unconventional warfare. We've made contact with locals and are currently assessing the situation. Encountered hostile forces employing scorched earth tactics on the civilian population. Providing immediate aid and security. Over. Baron, stand by." The radio fell silent as Boyer 1 processed the information, leaving Coleman waiting. During this lull, Elijah took the opportunity to address the elf in the back of the vehicle. "The fairy really makes you uncomfortable, doesn't she?" he asked as he still rifled through baggage. Azaleen shot a quick, scrutinizing glance at Elijah before her gaze fixated back on the still agitated Yana, fluttering erratically in the sky. "Yes," she began, her voice carrying a weight of experience. "I've seen what these little monsters can do to people." Her expression was a complex mix of wariness and nostalgia. The scene became a flurry of activity as they all did their best to prepare the survivors to leave the area. Bennett and another engineer were focused on fixing and reinforcing carts, ensuring they were functional enough for travel. The weapons sergeants were sorting through the mountain of salvage items, prioritizing what could be useful. With a grunt, Elijah pulled the 5-gallon jerry can from its secured location. When he looked around for help, his eyes fell on the team sergeant, Quan, and the intelligence sergeant, Jones, walking towards him. "I'm curious." Quan spoke up as he reached up to help with the jerry can. "So, why'd you decide to bother with the villagers?" he asked, looking at Elijah with an inquisitive gaze. Jones, who was standing a step behind, also chimed in. "I get that making contact and ingratiating ourselves with the locals would be useful, but we could have easily done that with a village that wasn't destroyed. This one's a complete write-off." As Elijah secured the equipment back into place, Coleman, who had been quietly listening, suddenly interjected and answered for him. "Information operations." "Bingo," Elijah responded with a grunt as he tightened the paracord knots. He then turned back to Quan and Jones, explaining further. "As you all know, our main directive is to influence, disrupt, corrupt, or usurp the decision-making process of our adversaries." Elijah continued, "By helping these villagers, we're creating a narrative. It's a strategic move. We're showing that we're not just invaders or combatants. We're allies, saviors even. This kind of goodwill can lead to more cooperation from the locals, better intel, and a more favorable view of our presence here." With an eye twitching with impatience, Quan spoke up once more to cut through the double-speak. Yeah, the standard information warfare bullshit. We get it, Eli. But get to the point. Why this village?" he said, demanding for a more direct answer to Jones' question. A moment of silence enveloped the group as Elijah looked around until his eyes fell on that teenage girl he pulled out of that cabinet. "They're doing scorched earth here. Burning their own villages and harassing their own people," he explained, turning back to Quan and Jones. "We need to be ahead of the curve in the information game. They've been caught red-handed, and we've got survivors to act as witnesses." He paused for emphasis, ensuring his words sank in. "If we jump from village to village, town to town, we can get a handle on the narrative before this empire or whatever they are, do. Our enemy is playing dirty and being brutal to their own people in an effort to turn the local population against us. If we can get ahead of this and spin it around, it'll open a lot of doors for us and make operating in this area significantly less complicated." Coleman spoke up, reinforcing Elijah's point. Elijah nodded in agreement. "Yep, if we take our survivors, act as saviors, and potentially intervene in any other attacks, we can make a significant impact in the information space and create a huge disconnect between the government and its people." He elaborated as he jumped down from the vehicle's roof. "Hearts and minds, gentlemen," he finished with an annoying, toothed smirk. "Hearts and minds." Just as Elijah finished his statement and hopped down from the vehicle, the radio crackled back to life, interrupting the conversation. "Baron, you are authorized to proceed with your new operation. Execute as you see fit. We're cutting you loose to manage this situation on the ground." "How copy?" The team members exchanged looks, a mixture of determination and resolve in their expressions. This was it, they were being given the green light to run the operation in their own style, adapting to the unique challenges of this environment and the unconventional warfare they were engaged in. Coleman keyed the radio, responding with a crisp acknowledgement. "Baron copies all, proceeding with the new mission as per new directives." "Baron out." Quan and Jones exchanged a look of understanding. What Elijah and Coleman said made a lot of sense, especially with a ground invasion looming on the horizon. If they could turn a few villages and towns friendly, it would significantly simplify operations for all Special Forces units operating in the area. Not only would mapping enemy locations become trivial, but we'd also probably get quite a bit of targets of opportunity, Elijah said as his gaze floated between the other three men. "And that's where my next little scheme comes into play." An evil smirk spreads across his face, causing Coleman to narrow his eyes and Quan to shift nervously. Jones was relatively new to the team and was the least familiar with Elijah's antics. The poor intelligence sergeant looked on with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "What scheme?" he asked, cautiously. Elijah leaned against the GMV, his gaze sharp. "Now that we've seen they're using a scorched earth policy, we should make it backfire spectacularly. If we start spreading these survivors out and dropping a few in each village and start a little strategic rumor mongering, maybe greasing a few palms where necessary. Before you know it, the locals aren't just passive observers, they become active participants in undermining their own tyrannical regime. Peasants start to get nervous and merchants become loose-lipped in an effort to save their family and property, Elijah said in nearly a sing-song voice as he looked up at Yana as she did her strange soul tornado ritual again. Then suddenly, you start getting high-value targets dropped in your lap. Kwan's expression hardened as he considered Elijah's plan. You want to break apart an already broken community even more, he asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. A scoff left Elijah's mouth as he waved dismissively. Oh please, as if the prospects of this community aren't already doomed. His gaze shifted to Azaleen, who had been quietly observing the discussion. Here, Elijah continued, switching to a language the elf could understand. We're talking about what to do with the survivors. What do you think the fate would be for the people of this village? He asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Surprised by the question, Azaleen looked back at Elijah with a raised eyebrow. After a brief pause, she spoke, her voice laced with a grim certainty. In situations like these, they would likely become slaves. She said indifferently, looking over at the women as if they were pitiful. At best, they'd be forced into brothels or work in taverns and whore themselves. Elijah turned back to Kwan with a look that said I told you so and leaned against the GMB. However, Coleman interjected and stood up. And I'm not going to allow that to happen. He said definitively as he shot Elijah a scolding look. Just because that is the norm here, does not mean we have to accept it. A sigh left Elijah's mouth as he rolled his eyes. We're at least going to try to get these people to a place of reasonable safety, Coleman continued, his tone firm and authoritative. The mission comes first, but we don't have to discard people like objects. Elijah wanted to protest as the thought of how rumors spread quickly among certain circles and professions crossed his mind, but he stopped himself. He decided it was best to let sleeping dogs lie. The man was rather cold and callous, but he could still read the room and people's emotions, so he thought better of rocking the boat. All right, everyone, let's hurry it up. Coleman bellowed as he clapped his. We need to be out of here within the hour. Let's get these survivors sorted and get the hell out of here. A collective grumble spread throughout the team as they picked up the pace, and it wasn't long until the villagers were helped onto the carts. Despite the bleakness of their situation, there was now a glimmer of hope. Maybe all was not lost after all. Lysandra sat on a strange stool over half her height as her brow furrowed with curiosity and wonder. The tavern she was in was unlike any place she had ever seen. The ambient light flickered from small lamps scattered throughout the small building, casting shadows that danced along the walls. People were gathered in small groups, engaged in hushed conversations or laughing heartily over shared jokes. In one corner, Lysandra watched as a group was absorbed in a game that involved sticks and balls on a table. Everything about the situation was alien. Even down to her attire. In stark contrast to the armor or loose clothing she usually wore, she found herself dressed in form-fitting clothes that were both stylish and shockingly flexible. The material hugged her body in a flattering and practical way, allowing for ease of movement. As she turned towards what looked like a large bar, Lysandra hummed in interest as she looked at the bottles of liquor that lined the wall, and her hand instinctively reached up to her left eye. She scratched at her eye patch, an old and bad habit when she was still trying to get used to its permanent presence. Anything I can get ya? Lysandra's attention was snapped back to the present as the bartender finally noticed her. A rotund, yet muscular man lumbered over, placing both hands firmly on the counter before leaning forward. The man gave her an unimpressed and annoyed look as his eyes traveled up and down, but Lysandra occasionally caught the man's gaze flicker away every moment or so. In the corner of the claustrophobic tavern was the group that strange stick and ball game, laughing and joking while slapping money on the table. Yes, Lysandra responded in her heavily accented English as she glanced briefly at the assortment of bottles behind him. I'm not quite sure. What do you recommend for someone new to this kind of establishment? The bartender sucked his teeth as he looked her up and down one more time. Probably something light, he said in a heavy drawl. Light. Lysandra repeated what the man had said as her sole good eye twitched. I do believe I'm capable of doing better than light. She said in mild annoyance. A childish grumble of a chuck left the bartender's mouth as he watched her scornful glare. Hey, all right then, lady. he said, turning around and grabbing a bottle of dark brown liquid. Don't tell me I didn't warn ya. Narrowing her eye, Lysandra watched him pour the liquid into a small glass, containing 2 large ice cubes that clinked against the sides. As he did so, the bartender smiled annoyingly and opened his mouth again. I dunno, you don't want something fruity and light? He said snidely. Enough, just give me the drink. Lysandra hissed, stabbing her finger onto the countertop. Another petulant laugh left the man's mouth as he handed over the glass, but his attention was suddenly diverted toward the group playing the game. Hey, he snapped in a deep drawl. Cut that shit out, or both of ya are getting thrown out on ya asses. The bartender's voice bellowed throughout the establishment. Lysandra's gaze turned to the corner where the group played that strange game. The atmosphere had shifted from friendly competition to something more tense. One player, visibly agitated, grabbed the other by the scruff of his neck and cocked his fist back. The potential victim's hand clenched around a fistful of money and moved his hands to protect his face when the bartender's threat caused them both to seize up and shrink away meekly. With the situation diffused, Lysandra returned her attention to her drink and took a cautious, but still generous sip. However, once the liquid had hit her tongue and slid down her throat, she almost regretted her decision. The drink was much stronger than she had anticipated, and its warmth quickly spread throughout her body as her tongue flicked against the roof of her mouth, and her long elven ears bounced up and down. It took everything she could to stop from choking and causing a scene, but she couldn't help but be struck by the drink's complex character. The alcohol, dark and enigmatic in its essence, cascaded over her tongue like a wave of intense, smoky flavors intertwined with subtle hints of caramel and spice. It was an intricate dance of tastes, each sip revealing new layers of depth that unfolded gradually, warming her from the inside out. The burn of the alcohol was strong, yet it was tempered by a lingering sweetness that clung to her palate, making it both challenging and intriguing. This was not just a drink, it was an experience, a journey through flavors she had never encountered in her previous world. Trying to maintain her composure, Lysandra couldn't help but feel the corners of her mouth twitch upwards in a reluctant smile. Feeling the need to tidy up after her adventurous sip, she looked to the bartender and requested, a napkin, or something similar, please. The bartender, with an arrogant smirk, leaned in closer. Having trouble there? He teased in a condescending tone. Lysandra shot him a glare, her good eye narrowing into a slit, but she chose not to engage any further, and she waited silently to do as he was told. With a chuckle, the bartender bent down and grabbed a fistful of napkins, placing them on the counter with a deliberate thud. Here you go, lil miss, he said, still smiling. Snatching the napkins of his hand with an icy look, Lysandra delicately dabbed her lips as she stared down the smirking bartender. Even when he went off to service other customers or busy himself with other tasks, she still glared hatefully at the man as she slid the napkins into her pocket. It took her a while, but Lysandra finally calmed down and slowly finished the rest of her liquid treat. She sat there sipping contentedly as she glanced around, observing the dynamics of this shifty and strange tavern. But it wasn't long until she decided she had her fill of this new experience and stood up to take her leave. As she walked out of the tavern, Lysandra felt the shift in atmosphere from the dimly lit, bustling interior to the cool, open air of the outside world. The change was refreshing, a welcome reprieve from the close confines and the intense scrutiny of the tavern's patrons. Gaining some distance from the establishment, she turned a corner, her senses heightened by the unfamiliar surroundings. It was then, out of the corner of her good eye, she noticed something unsettling, 2 figures discreetly following her. It was only a momentary glimpse, but it was enough to set off the alarm bells in her mind. She tried to recall their features, piecing together their appearances in her head. Then it clicked, they were the same individuals involved in the heated game involving sticks and balls at the tavern. Her instincts kicked in, and Lysandra quickened her pace, her hand instinctively reaching into her pocket, feeling for anything that might aid her in a confrontation. The rhythmic sound of her pursuer's footsteps grew louder, indicating they too had increased their speed. Suddenly, she heard the rapid approach of footsteps and a voice calling out, "Miss! Miss! You forgot something." Lysandra's heart pounded as she weighed her options, to confront or continue evading. And coming to a snap decision, she faced the situation head-on. Turning sharply, she braced herself to confront the 2 men, her hand still firmly inside her pocket, ready for whatever was about to unfold. When the 2 men approached, Lysandra noted a slight hesitation in their steps, but they continued to advance. The closer of the 2, breathing heavily from the chase, managed to say, "Ma'am, look, you forgot this." he said, looking at his friend who was reaching into his pocket. But Lysandra noticed something strange. They were still maintaining their brisk pace. Without hesitation, Lysandra immediately tried to yank her hand out of her pocket, but the men were faster. One of them leaped at her, attaching themselves to her arm while the other rushed her, pulling out a knife. Lysandra stumbled back from the sudden tackle, but she was still in the fight. Her other hand shot up, grabbing the wrist of the knife-wielding assailant. She initially struggled to maintain her footing. Once steadied, Lysandra pushed forward with all her might, slamming everyone, including herself, against the wall, eliciting a chorus of gasps and yelps of pain, but the men clung on tenaciously. Bracing herself, Lysandra yanked her arm back with all her strength, causing the man hanging onto her to fly back with a scream. Now free, she finally was able to pull the gun that was resting in her pocket and aimed it directly at the face of the remaining attacker. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but before she could act, a sudden booming voice filled the air. "Stop scenario." Everyone immediately relaxed at the sound of the command, and their hands dropped to their sides. "Jesus fucking Christ, why is she so goddamn strong?" The man who flew off complained as he crawled on the ground. As the man groaned, a litany of instructors and cadre started to come out of the woodwork as if they just materialized out of thin air. Among them was a woman with striking blonde hair dressed in black jeans and a gray t-shirt that looked more at home on a college campus other than the infamous CIA training ground, also known simply as the farm. The blonde stepped forward with her arms crossed, and even though she was petite and dainty, the woman exuded authority as she looked over everyone with an expression that said she wasn't to be trifled with. "Well done, I'm impressed." The woman began with an encouraging tone. "You're rather convincing in some areas, but your approach has a few fatal flaws." She continued while walking up to Lysandra with a clipboard in hand. The blonde cadre looked down at the man writhing in pain and raised an eyebrow before turning back to Lysandra. "For instance, putting the napkin in your pocket," she continued, "no one does that." Another point of contention, the blonde cadre glanced over her clipboard again. "Is your situational awareness. You need to be mindful of your exits and potential threats. You were already made by your first mistake, but during your exfil, you focused too much on your immediate aggressors and missed opportunities to escape or use your environment to your advantage." She retraced Lysandra's steps and pointed out critical details in the alleyway. Lysandra scratched behind her ears and interjected, addressing the instructor by name. "Jamie, I didn't have much time." It only took a few seconds for them to catch up. Jamie stared briefly at the elf before tossing her clipboard to another instructor and snapping her fingers, signaling the scenario to reset. "Jared, stop wriggling around like a bitch," she called out to the man still on the ground. "You and Mike, go back to where Lysandra first saw you." The two men groaned as they got up and moved to reposition themselves as instructed. Jamie in the meantime, prepared to demonstrate an alternative course of action as she assumed the role of Lysandra and gestured for the elf to observe closely. "Watch how I handle this," Jamie said as she started walking the same path Lysandra had taken. As soon as she rounded the corner and spotted Jared and Mike, she didn't hesitate. Jamie broke into a swift sprint. In a matter of seconds, Jamie reached the dumpster near the wall, and without slowing down, she leaped onto it, using the momentum to propel herself upward toward the fire escape ladder. She grabbed the ladder's lower rungs with practiced ease, pulled herself up, and slipped into the shadows of a doorway. By the time Jared and Mike reached the same point, they turned the corner to see an empty alleyway with no sign of their target. They looked around and heaved an annoyed sigh while their eyes scanned the area for any trace of Jamie, but she had vanished into thin air. After a few moments, Jamie popped her head out from the doorway, looking down at Lysandra. "From here," she began, gesturing towards the shadowy doorway she had used for her escape, "you have options. You can pick the lock and make entry into the building, giving you a chance to either find a hiding spot or a new exit. Or," she paused, pointing up to the higher levels of the fire escape, "you can keep going up, putting more distance between you and your pursuers." "Of fucking course." Mike rolled his eyes and threw his arms up. "Of course, you're up there, why wouldn't you be?" "I swear, she's a goddamn monkey," Jared added, scratching his head. Lysandra's eye twitched, partly in awe and partly in frustration. Lysandra found the speed of Jamie's decision-making, coupled with her agility without the aid of any form of magical empowerment, difficult to comprehend. Being able to harness the powers of mana naturally from a young age, Lysandra was always used to relying on her physical abilities and enhanced senses. Still, Jamie's approach made her aware that maybe she had grown reliant on those abilities. Noticing Lysandra's reaction, Jamie climbed down from her perch and walked back towards the group. But, these are all just minor tactical issues. The most concerning is that you were made in the first place, she started, addressing the core of Lysandra's earlier actions. As you can tell, I'm not particularly strong, and I don't have that magic shit or whatever to overpower someone. If two men like Jared and Mike caught me, it's over. So the first order of things is, don't get made, Jamie said, holding up a singular finger. If you're made, don't get caught. She then threw up a second finger. And finally, if you're caught, don't die. As Jamie laid out the cardinal rules of their line of work, Lysandra felt as if each was a stab in the heart. She had struck 2 for 3. As she mulled over Jamie's words, Lysandra couldn't help but scratch at her eye patch, a gesture that had become a subconscious tic whenever she was deep in thought or grappling with a problem. You said I was convincing though, Lysandra said meekly in an attempt to defend herself. Wouldn't most people just glaze that I put a napkin in my pocket? A sigh left Jamie's mouth as she flicked some hair out of her face. You're not trying to convince most people. You're trying to convince trained observers, Jamie lectured, emphasizing each word. You need to blend in and become effectively background noise. Jamie then turned to Mike and Jared and crossed her arms. Besides the napkin, what else made Lysandra stand out to you? Why did you pay more attention to her than the other trainees in the bar? She was talking too much, Jared responded first and stated bluntly. In a place like that, most people are there to unwind and mind their own business. They don't engage much with the staff, beyond what's necessary, especially as a first-timer. Mike nodded in agreement and added his perspective. It didn't necessarily give her away per se, but it drew a lot more attention than it needed to. And honestly, that's all we needed to key her as a person of interest. Lysandra cringed and shifted uncomfortably at the critique while her ears drooped slightly in distress. The sharpness of the feedback, while meant to be constructive, had clearly struck a chord with her. Sensing Lysandra's discomfort, Jamie's demeanor softened significantly. She let out a gentle sigh and offered a more approachable, almost nurturing smile as she stepped closer to Lysandra. She decided it was best to switch from the strict instructor and change her approach to something more palpable, like a guiding mentor. Hey, look, Jamie said softly in a tone that carried warmth. I know you're new at this, and we're kinda just thrown to the wolves, so I understand it can be tough to hear. She continued placing a hand on Lysandra's arm. But you're doing really well and we just want you to succeed. You have experiences and knowledge from the other side that we don't, and that's invaluable to us. She gestured to the rest of the instructors and cadre. So we need to make sure you're not just qualified, but overqualified so when you come back, you can train the next generation that comes through, or even train us. When Lysandra looked up, the disheartened look on her face started to melt away as she took a deep breath. The cadre's words of encouragement seemed to reignite a sense of renewed determination within her as her posture straightened and her ears perked up slightly. I understand, Lysandra responded, her voice steady. Let's continue then. Observing the change in demeanor, Jamie couldn't help but smile, pleased with the elf's response. However, her professionalism immediately snapped back into place when she turned back to her team. All right, everyone. Jamie announced, addressing the instructors and trainees. Let's take a break from tradecraft for now and transition to weapons and joint operations training. Jamie's hands clapped together and she began walking out of the alleyway. We've still got a lot to cover. The clicks of Toivonen's heels echoed throughout the walls of the Pentagon as she walked with a sense of purpose. She was dressed impeccably in her sleek business top with her pencil skirt and exuded the perfect blend of professionalism and elegance. As she made her way through the corridors of such vaunted and prestigious halls, she passed by men and women in their dress uniforms so impeccably maintained and adorned with a litany of service ribbons, and they were the envy of all. But today, Toivonen's presence took priority as she clutched tightly at a relatively thick folder nestled securely within her arms. Toivonen's journey through the Pentagon stopped her in front of a particular door with 2 stern-looking military police, MP, officers standing outside. A strange foreboding feeling started to swell in the pit of her stomach as she closed her eyes and sucked in a deep breath. For all that had gone wrong that past half-year, she had managed to stay afloat and lock in a meeting with the highest echelons of the United States. This wasn't just another high-level meeting, it was potentially a defining moment not only for her career but for the trajectory of national security and global affairs. As Toivonen stood there, her thoughts raced, and the specter of self-doubt began to rear its ugly face. The sheer magnitude of what lay ahead was starting to become overwhelming. Right now, she was about to present critical intelligence and recommendations on matters that would reshape the fate of not only the United States but the world. They stood on the precipice, and Toivonen would be the slight nudge that would send them over the edge. The two MPs in front of her maintained their hard, neutral expressions, trained to be the epitome of military professionalism. However, sensing her hesitation, one of them, a dark-skinned man with a steely gaze, caught Toivonen's eye and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Drawing in another deep breath, Toivonen steeled herself and stepped forward. "Ma'am, identification please." One of the MPs spoke as they both nodded at Toivonen. Tremors of nervousness coursed through Toivonen as her hands gripped tightly around the plastic ID badge. However, through force of will, she fought through her nerves and pulled the lanyard forward to present it to the MP. The large, muscular man grabbed her credentials and took a moment to scrutinize the badge, his eyes flicking from her face to the imprinted photo. Cross-referencing the attendance sheet, triple-checked her face, her name, and her clearance level printed on it. Satisfied, he then nodded to his colleague, who stepped forward with a handheld biometric scanner. "Please place your thumb on the scanner, ma'am," the second MP instructed. Toivonen complied, pressing her thumb firmly against the glass surface of the device. The scanner whirred, verifying her fingerprint against the Pentagon's secure database. After a brief moment, a green light blinked on the device, signaling a successful match. The MPs exchanged glances before the one with the scanner spoke. "Apologies for the delay, ma'am. You're cleared to proceed." With her identification verified, Toivonen quickly stepped through the door as the MP turned back to their security detail. Once in the new room, she was immediately met with a metal detector and various unknown scanning devices, hinting at the level of security and secrecy of the meeting she was about to attend. But beyond the security checkpoint, the atmosphere of the room shifted noticeably. Several soldiers populated it, and these individuals had a different air than the MPs outside. Unlike the usual strict and rigid professionalism a soldier would have in these vaunted halls, these men exuded a more relaxed and casual demeanor. Yet, there was an undercurrent of alertness and danger to their presence. They were clad in various customized and personalized gear, their weapons not standard issue but rather tailored to their individual preferences and roles. Toivonen recognized them immediately. These people were no ordinary soldiers, nor were they ordinary security detail. The organizers of this meeting were taking no chances and enlisted a highly trained Special Missions Unit from the Exalted Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, to safeguard them. Their presence here spoke volumes about the level of secrecy and importance of this evening. As she passed through the metal detectors, the soft beep and hum of devices echoed throughout the room, signifying their scans had completed. The operators in the room observed her intensely as they moved closer. "ID, please, ma'am," one of them requested in a less than formal tone but still maintained a semblance of procedure. Complying with the operator's request, Toivonen presented her credentials once more. The operators quickly glanced at her ID, their eyes flicking back and forth between the badge and Toivonen herself. After a brief examination, one of them spoke up, "Please spread your arms and legs, ma'am." "I apologize for the intrusion." Toivonen did as instructed and stood still as another operator approached her with a strange-looking device. The operator meticulously waved a paddle-like device across every inch of her body as if scanning for something. It was an invasive process, but Toivonen understood the importance of such stringent security measures given the nature of the meeting. Once the operators seemed satisfied with the results, they nodded to her, indicating that she was cleared to proceed. "They're waiting for you inside," the soldier said, moving out of the way. With her ID around her neck and her documents snug against her body, Toivonen prepared to enter the final stage of her journey to the meeting. However, the weight of the moment caused her to pause one last time before stepping into the room where decisions of immense consequence were to be made. Collecting her thoughts and calming her nerves, Toivonen took one last breath before throwing open the door. Once inside, she was met with the gaze of some of the most powerful individuals in the United States. The room was filled with high-ranking military officers and top government officials, and each of them stared directly at her. The Secretary of Defense, Mark Lee, sat stoically, his eyes seemingly trying to bore a hole into her. Besides him, the Secretary of State, Cassandra Easton, had a much more subdued and harder-to-read expression as she quietly conversed with an aide. The Joint Chiefs of Staff and their chairmen were engaged in their own hushed discussion at one end of the table, while the Speaker of the House, Marcus Shaw, motioned for her to sit down. For a moment, Toivonen found herself standing there like a deer in the headlights, but her training soon kicked in. Steeling herself, she turned off her emotions, confidently strode towards the large ornate table, placed her documents in front of the Director of National Intelligence, and sat down. "Well, now that's Michigan's girl here, let's get started," the Speaker of the House said, turning towards the Director of National Intelligence, Thomas Dalton, for him to introduce the girl. "Ladies, gentlemen, Mr. President, this is Ms. Evelina Toivonen from the Central Intelligence Agency." Thomas Dalton stood up and gestured towards Toivonen. She and many of her esteemed colleagues have been instrumental in spearheading a project that has not only helped us understand the language of these extraterrestrial beings, but has also played a critical role in enlisting individuals who can help us better understand the strange energy these beings wield. As Dalton spoke, murmurs echoed among the officials from NATO countries and allied nations listening in through a secure broadcast. One voice, with a distinct British accent, broke through the murmurs. "Director Dalton, could you elaborate on the nature of this strange energy? How does it differ from our conventional understanding of physics or energy manipulation?" Another voice, this time from a French official, spoke in a concerned tone, "And what about the potential uses for this knowledge? Are there exotic resources required that are only found on the other side of that rift to use it?" A barrage of questions came hurtling through the broadcast as representatives of allied nations expressed their concerns and curiosity. The topics ranged from the potential for energy production using this new form of energy to the geopolitical implications of being the only nation with access to this new plane of reality. Sensing the need to address these concerns diplomatically, a top scientist from the project team stood up to speak. She glanced at the Secretary of State, who nodded subtly in approval, signaling her to proceed.